Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
The loneliness of being alone together. That's what people often say about marriages that don't work out. Our union with Andrew was a little different. He was much older than me and married late. What surprised everyone around him? Because he was remarkably good-looking. I noticed it many times later. When we appeared together in a crowded place, women often turned to look at Andrew. Where else would you meet a man who looks exactly like the macho man on the cover of a book? Why did he marry me? I couldn't even explain it to myself. The mirror never flattered me. Not to the point where I thought I made a decent match for Andrew. Besides, a hard life doesn't make anyone pretty. And I've had a very hard life since I was a young girl. I was orphaned very young. In the car accident that killed my parents, I was the only survivor. I avoided the orphanage. My aunt took custody of me. She moved in with me and took care of me diligently all the years until I came of age. There was never any intimacy between us, but I can't reproach her for neglecting her duties. I was always fed, cleanly dressed. I had everything I needed for my studies. My aunt made sure I did my homework. She went to parent-teacher conferences and bought me birthday presents. And when I turned 18, I got a surprise. It turns out that my aunt was saving money, a pension, which I was getting for my parents. "Doria, I want to have a serious talk with you," she said. "Let's use this money to buy you a nice room, and you'll sign over the apartment to me." After all, it's such hard work taking care of someone else's child for years. And I got a penny from the state for it. If I was a little more experienced, I'd ask. As they say, you can guess where I would have sent the aunt in response to such a proposal. But at 18, I was still a child and obediently signed all the necessary documents. A room. My aunt really picked a nice one for me. In a 2-room apartment, the neighbors are a decent family, a mother with an adult daughter. We established a good relationship right away. My room was bigger than theirs. Spacious, bright, with a neighbor's balcony. When they did the laundry, they asked permission to hang the laundry there. And in return, they regularly treated me to all sorts of goodies, from homemade pies to homemade cake. A year later in the spring, walking in the park, I met Andrew. There was some sort of outdoor dance, and he asked me to slow dance. I was just passing by and had no intention of joining the dancing couples, but it was impossible to refuse Andrew. He courted me so gallantly and proposed so quickly that before I knew it, I was married. Andrew insisted that we sell my room and his apartment and buy a new place. A nice steel one in the center of town. We put the apartment in Andrew's name. He said it would make the paperwork easier. I was not at all sophisticated in these matters and just trusted him. Our difficulties started soon after the wedding. It was very modest, a few girlfriends on my side, and one single friend on my husband's side. About his parents, Andrew said that they lived far away, and there was no need for them to travel across the country to sit in a restaurant. So there was no one to tell me about the man I married. As it turned out, Andrew was passionate about children. It was his thing. Before, I thought that all those ladies' novels about cool bosses going crazy with excitement at the thought of having an heir, all those novels were nonsense. But it turns out Andrew would do anything to have a son. It's hard to convey his disappointment when he found out I'd failed to get pregnant in the first few months of marriage. He insisted that I quit my job and get treatment. By that time, I had already finished my courses and was working in a flower store. I liked the job very much, and I didn't want to leave it. But I did it for my husband's sake. After a thorough examination in a private medical center, it turned out that I didn't need any treatment. There was nothing wrong. And then I found out that my husband in the past suffered from a severe form of drug addiction, passed a very serious rehabilitation, and the problem of our inactivity undoubtedly in him. For several weeks he didn't speak to me. Again, had I been more experienced and more confident, maybe I would have taken a very different tone with my husband. But he became for me the second person after my aunt, who had some responsibility for me and who cared about my fate. At night I cried quietly, asking myself how long it would last and how it would end. And the end of it all was that crazy evening when Andrew came home out of the blue with a man I had seen in person at the wedding. I knew he was Andrew's buddy. His name is Kevin, and he's like a doctor. Now I see it in a different light. He probably treated my husband when he was on drugs. I set the table, emptied the refrigerator almost completely, and ate. When I saw the amount of alcohol, some kind of holiday, something to celebrate, I asked. In its own way, muttered my husband. I had never drunk strong drinks before that evening. All my acquaintance with alcohol was limited to champagne and occasionally a couple of glasses of semi-sweet wine. Andrew did the sleath thing. If he'd given me cognac, I would have killed and refused. But he made a cocktail, orange juice, ice. In short, I didn't even realize I was drunk for the first time in my life. But the men were pretty drunk too. That's when Andrew dragged me into the bedroom, saying, "Maybe you'll get a kick out of it." And a minute later, he sent Kevin in there. I did not remember the night well, but I remembered the deadly resentment I felt towards my husband, the desire to take revenge on him, and the drunkenness, feeling a sense of permissiveness. I woke up late with a heavy head and realized that I was home all alone. The men had already left. Andrew and I didn't speak for a few more days, steeled by remorse. I decided to pretend that everything that had happened simply hadn't happened. After all, almost everyone has some crazy things happen in their lives. And then Kevin called me. To say that my cheeks swelled would be an understatement, although the call was strictly business. "Daria, you're not working right now, are you?" he asked, after what we had. He also spoke in first name, so, as I decided to pretend it never happened. "I don't know if your husband told you. I'm the head physician at a private nursing home, and we're in dire need of staff. The job is simple, taking care of old people. The pay is good. It would seem that there should be enough applicants. But we have to turn down a lot of applicants. People come in who are irresponsible, drunk. Today they're out, and tomorrow I can't count on them. It would seem impossible for my cheeks to burn hotter. But it happened. Would you like to try it?" asked Kevin. With great joy I answered. The first time I was so nervous that I poured myself half a shot of valerian before work. And then to repel the smell, I used poison mint gum. In our nursing home, there are 2 floors. On the first floor are placed the fastest old people. They walk either on their own, or with a stick, or even with skates, but they walk. And for this we love them sincerely. The old people live 2 by 2 in each ward. They have a toilet and a shower, and they go to the canteen themselves. Of course, not everything is so smooth. There are some nasty grandparents, like Wendy for example, who will always be unhappy. Cleaning is a problem for her. One minute she's sleepy and my cleaning is in the way. "Turn off the vacuum cleaner," she shouts pitifully. She won't let me open the window. Even in the heat of summer, she is drafty and cold. The food in the canteen is unpalatable. No entertainment. She perceives any visitor as a person who is ready to listen to her endless complaints about life. The only person who could put her in her place is our Dr. Kevin. She realizes that her life depends on him to some extent, and she listens to him as God. She'd be willing to complain to him about her illnesses nonstop. It's a shot here and a sting there. In short, my paws are aching and my tail is falling off. But Kevin stopped that from the start. The more you talk about illnesses, the more you prepare the ground for them to develop. Depression starts to set in, which undermines the body. And in that case, you can die simply from a runny nose. Right now, there are 2 people against your illnesses, you and me. But if you take their side and force me to fight them alone, well, then he spread his hands. Wendy often nodded, looking at him obsequiously in the eyes. "And to strengthen your body, I prescribe you to drink a shot every day like a mountain and snack on a sandwich with red caviar." Kevin knew that this patient had the means to eat Roman apples. Otherwise, he wouldn't have ordered such a thing. The family would have paid more if Wendy hadn't sent them a homely atmosphere. I was the one who didn't come in right away. But then, after talking to another nurse, Vanessa, experienced caregiver, came to the same conclusion, where Vanessa only did not work and in public hospitals, and at home for the sick cared for. And she said to me, "Sure, it's nice here. Everything is clean, beautiful, comfortable, like in a sanatorium. But on the other hand, these old people feed us. We're in their service. So no matter how they behave, we have to politely, with a smile, God forbid, raise our voice or tell the same tick in the eye who it is. It's easier in a regular hospital where you can yell. She thought about it and added, if it hurt, of course. But Grandma Maria, we all just adore. And it would not have been fated to be an ordinary village grandmother. But her son made it big. Now he has his own big company. Grandma Maria, talking about her son, always says the words big, big, big boss. And his house is big, and his car is big, and his dacha is huge. Purely rural house of culture asked Grandma Maria not to live in his village house. Why cockroaches, at least in winter, daughter-in-law did not allow. Her daughter-in-law doesn't like her, though, and tried to behave Grandma Maria quieter than water below the grass. But still some orders daughter-in-law violated. There were too many to remember. Her son persuaded her to move here to the village. And in winter, you can't even drive on those roads. And you mom will be well fed, and a doctor nearby, and women of the same age. You'll have someone to talk to. And I'll come often. He really did come, brought his mother what she always called hotels all in a row, and a beautiful French robe in front of you. She immediately put it away in her closet, in her coffin bag. Repeated that in the coffin will lie beautiful as a bride in this luxury and overseas fruit, which Grandma Maria has never tried and taste. She was afraid only green. Maybe not ripe, and a huge box of chocolates. She herself wanted something simpler. I've often observed that old people return to their childhood dreams and want to fulfill them. And I myself heard her asking her son Jack, "Don't buy me expensive things. Bring me something embarrassing to say. Bring me a can of green peas and a can of runny milk." I dreamed as a girl that someday I'd open a can and eat it all with a big spoon. Our family, remember, was always limited. You share with your brothers and sisters. What's in it for you? 2 peas and a drop of that condensed milk. Grandma Maria lived without a roommate. Her son had paid for a separate room for her, and her room was like a hospital room or even a sanatorium ward. What about in a hut? In the corner with a small lamp, Grandma Maria understood all her responsibility for carelessness with fire. Yes, in their village with wooden houses, everyone was terribly afraid of fire. And she only lit the light bulb on Easter or Christmas Eve for an hour. While she sang the word of prayer, she had her own TV set too. No need to go to the common living room. But Grandma Maria didn't like TV. She was always angry that they were broadcasting scary extra programs. All apologized while listening, but the radio was much better. She left her favorite Kalina Red channel, on which one after another transmitted songs, took out a plastic box. Back in the year 70s, when white, now yellow absorbent cotton put on big glasses with thick panes and delved into needlework. How much higher than that? And there was more than a few things tied up in her room. That was what gave it a resemblance to the village, for it was covered with once sown cornflowers and poppies, bound with science. Dushkin pillows embroidered and crocheted, curtains, towels, tablecloths, napkins. The room was blooming. Grandma Maria did not forget us either. I had a blue shawl as a keepsake, tied by her hands. Vanessa had everything, including Lucy the dishwasher. Grandma Maria had a memento of some kind. And for Kevin, she knitted a beautifully knitted reindeer sweater and convinced him that he could sleep in the snow like that. If we had any committees, Nina, the headmistress, would try to get the guests into the room. Grandma Maria, and here we have a real museum of Russian culture, she said. The guests were amazed. And there were some good grandfathers too. We had Chuck and William. The first one also came from the village. I went through the war, and not like now. A lot of people call themselves veterans, but they barely smelled gunpowder themselves. No, he was a machine gunner. Women usually live longer. They don't. Chuck buried his wife and daughter. That's not wasted. There's a hug left in him. Which one of us kids never complained about anything? He was happy with everything. The most upsetting thing was that he was rapidly losing his eyesight, almost couldn't read. But he always came. Whatever evenings we organized in the living room, even children from the kindergarten would come to perform poems and dances in front of the old people. A local poet would drop by to read poetry. Someone who lives here will come in to read a book aloud. Chuck, in the first rows of listeners, will be his neighbor William. Though he resembled him in appearance, also light, thin, also saw everything worse. But from Chuck differed a very intelligent man who studied to be an engineer with a red diploma. He got his main education in the camps. During the years of repressions, he could tell very interesting, and for hours about those with whom he sat in prisons, met in exile. He slept side by side on the camp bunks. But the same cruel life accustomed him to trust no one. And his family didn't work out. He also very much wanted to stay in this world, to live a little longer. And he was always afraid that he was about to die. Any pain in his heart he perceived as a precursor of a heart attack in his head, as a precursor of a stroke. Then it seemed to him that his heart stopped. Then his hands possessed several times a day. He was getting on the scale. Wasn't he losing weight? Wasn't gnawing? Was there a secretly evil tumor in him? Kevin used to check in on him several times a day, just to reassure him. Worse, if a panic attack hit our old man. Ambulances weren't very willing to come to our house at night. Sometimes she was delayed for an hour or two, and we called her often. After all, the second floor was filled with our lying old people. We had more of them. Many relatives were simply tormented, ready to pay any money, just to return to the former way of life, not to jump up to the patient at night, not to be tied to his regime. It really takes skill. At one time I thought I'd never make it. The patients are different. Some are light as a feather, some are heavy. Alas, they can't lift. Vanessa showed me how to lift such an old man, to wash him, to change his underwear. And there are so many little things. To take care of one at home can make your head spin. And if you have a dozen of them, and how many of them need to be spoon-fed? It's not quick. The second thing is to persuade them that everything is tasty, that they need to eat. Vanessa said that when she worked in a regular hospital, there were 50 people per hospital. So another nurse would just put a plate on the patient's chest and go, and do as you wish with a spoon, like a dog. There are many more such old people here cared for. And the face in a complex combination. A smile and a clutch of teeth. Almost all grandparents from well-to-do families. But the strength is simply not left to their loved ones. Here Helen, if we did not have it, her daughter, would have to part with her husband to 1,000 gimmicks at the old lady. I do many manipulations just on automatic to put on a gray, similar kerchief, fluff, chick rings, open the window, and immediately correct any curtain so that you do not feel a draft. Daria, I need to cut my nails today and my feet are good too. And with the sulfur, they're all cold and lifeless. So at least blood will be shed from the bleachers to grease my nails and feet. Massage with cream. I start gently, rubbing. Old people's bodies are fragile, so it doesn't hurt. It won't leave a bruise. I can't feel it. Helen is angry. Daria is stronger. When the massage ends, it turns out that the tea is already quite cold, and it is necessary to hurry to the kitchen for a new portion of porridge. Helen, with a shudder, refuses it with unleavened food. Nauseated, she asks for a sandwich. As always, I linger longest in her room. But that's okay. There's only Grandma Miranda left. Well, I mean, she's still all touched up and doesn't realize where she is at all. Thinks she's on a train. Nina didn't even want to take her. Golden Autumn doesn't specialize in the mentally ill. But Miranda turned out to be an unusually quiet creature. And I feel sorry for her son. Or rather, the whole family. They don't have much money. Both husband and wife work. And Miranda is afraid to leave home. She thinks she's on a train. The decision was made when Miranda, in the absence of home, climbed through the window on the third floor, explaining the noise to passers-by. The full conductor locked the compartment. And now it's my station to go to. One of the strange men managed to run into the entrance, kicked the door to the apartment with his shoulder. Luckily, it wasn't iron. Dragged my grandmother back in. What else could she have done with my aunt's words? I don't know. She closes the bathroom door behind her and can't open it. She starts screaming and calling for help. Then she goes out into the stairwell and asks every cross-dresser she meets, "Is the train coming soon or is she late?" Pity, Loved ones risked it, took it. And so far nothing extraordinary has happened. True, Miranda drinks tea only from a glass with a subcup. And my daughter needs to get a firm grip on the handle. Or as the carriage shakes, as grandmother pours steep boiling water from the hospital to go and go. Well, you can put up with that. And when Miranda asks where we're going now and if the end of the road is coming soon, she's always content to say, "You remember, don't you, Miranda? It's a big country, so we've got a long way to go." Kevin prescribed her some pills, after which Miranda decided to fit more into life and take advantage of all the outings. And in the keys to me and my daughter, road radio, and then you and I will go to the restaurant in the car. Anyway, just as he prescribed the pills, he canceled them. As soon as I served all my pets and was about to go already to the dining room to drink tea with pies. What pies with apples and cinnamon gave today for breakfast? The smell made me dizzy. I was anticipating drinking tea like a second orderly. Vanessa opened Miranda's door and shouted at me Daria and us called downstairs. We'll be meeting the new grandmother. New B, why both of us? Oh, wait, the one for whom the suite is for. Vanessa nodded. Our boarding house took over a building that used to belong to a daycare center. And the big playroom on the first floor, with its south-facing windows, has been turned into a suite. The suite was empty most of the time. It was too expensive for mere mortals to afford. And the suite was, of course, a single room. I can imagine, Vanessa whispered. And the ass and dough will probably have to be wiped with fluff. She bored us. Down we went, wary and interested extremely. We didn't have to wait long. A quarter of an hour, maybe, a car pulled up. A nice color. Better not ask the make. I can tell the difference between a car and a bus at best. I've never owned a car. A young man got out, opened the back door, and offered his hand to the woman, looking at the companion he was leading down the driveway. Vanessa and I soaped the granny. Her tongue didn't turn to call her that. Small in stature, graceful, gray-haired in a light-colored cloak. She walked lightly, and her shoes had heels too. I think I underestimated the scale. Vanessa stretched out. She's not just torturing us, she's outliving us. I looked at Vanessa. She is big, formidable badly. I couldn't even find a robe in the right size for her, and Vanessa is wearing a colored robe, increasing her resemblance to an Asian woman. She has black hair knotted at the back of her head, thick black eyebrows. It's a good thing we're on a shift together. Vanessa can be summoned without a problem. To help lift the heaviest patients. She helps them out like bears. On the other shift, there are two nurses of about the same build, both elderly. It's harder for them, if anything. Vanessa came to us through an ad posted in the church. She's very religious, and when she enters the rooms where the old ladies have icons, she crosses herself. Vanessa likes almost everything, except the most harmful, but even those trust her more than me, for example, or the girls from the other shift. Can't imagine the mighty Vanessa dropping anyone. Oh, how did we get the groupies away from her? It was our shift change. The night nurse came in on her night shift. Vanessa and I had just gone downstairs to get dressed. Sunlight jumps up the stairs and shouts in a proper voice that her grandmother is dead. Nina didn't even give her a hard time afterwards. But then we were really confused. What to do? Vanessa just kept her cool. I called Nina and Kevin. Did they leave already? Called for a special car. That's when it all started. There's this dead guy and a driver no better. They took one look at the dead man and said, "Carry him downstairs." Carry the man down, dear us. What are we to you? Who are we to you? How can we carry her? How can we lift her? It turns out that one man is post-op. The other is just shaking his head, saying, "I can't lift it." It's worse than dragging the grand piano up 16 floors without an elevator. Vanessa spits on her palms and says, "But we'll all do it." And right there on the blanket, a man is dragging by one end and pulling by the other. We grab. Vanessa's panting. That's how we carried the body down. I remember that blizzard, flakes of snow in the face, the subway, slippery, icy paths, which for some reason we fell on every now and then. It was a shorter song. The next day, we found out that the relatives were big fans of a newspaper like HEA. They demanded a pathologist. In vain, Kevin assured them he could write their aunt's diagnosis with his eyes closed. Where was it? Or maybe she had died from not being treated. It was said with frothing at the mouth. Kevin just waved his hand. And this firm will probably have to hang a teaspoon and a half of sugar in cups with a silver spoon. Vanessa whispered doomedly. No, you tell me, why did she come here? I shrugged. No relatives who sent their loved ones to the Golden Fall. I could understand. I couldn't understand her wanting to move in with us. She walked under the arm of her grandson so briskly that she looked more like a member of some high-ranking committee called to find out if everything was in order, if, for example, the fire extinguisher was in place, and whether the all-important paperwork was properly drawn up and signed. At the open door to the suite stood Nina herself as a doorman. Seeing us, she waved that you come over. Quickly, we obediently approached. The suite, naturally, shone with cleanliness. She was sitting in a chair under a palm tree, and a young man of very pleasant appearance stood beside her. Anna, across from your room is our living room. You can always sit there, talk to someone. We have very friendly residents, piano, record player, library, walks, activities twice a week. Dinner's coming up. If you want a special menu, maybe you could order food from the restaurant? We do have that option. We bring it in. To be honest, we brought a cake for Semyon Grigorievich's anniversary once, when he was 90 years old. Mole nodded her head, but with a kind of unmistakable dignity. It didn't even need to be emphasized, it lived in her. Anton, can you leave quietly? She turned to the young man. See, you're leaving me with nothing. No, absolutely not. In a hurry, Nina, our girls, Vanessa and Daria. Girls, come, at any time you can call. They will do everything you need and read, and take you for a walk. In general, they will do everything. Almost silently, Vanessa said, Will you also give me a bell? As soon as the madam calls, we'll be here at attention. What do you want? We have a lot of time to read books to everyone. I also supported her quietly with a corner of my mouth. Molai looked at us attentively, and equally attentive was the look of her companion. He had very beautiful brown eyes, and in general he resembled either Jewish or pre-revolutionary intellectuals. But it didn't matter to me what kind of eyes he had. Thank you. I don't need anything yet, I said. I'd like to stay with my grandson. To say goodbye. Of course. Nina nodded. Why don't one of the girls clean up and organize your things? Thank you, I told Molelai. She was still sitting there with her back straight as a string. We went out and Vanessa, who was bolder, hard to embarrass in general, immediately inquired, Why is she saying goodbye to him? Nina, he is leaving the other day, explained our main abroad in France long business trip. My grandmother has a heart condition, and he was afraid to leave her alone and hire a nurse. So there is not one to hire 2 or 3 at least. Sighed Nina. She wildly now in 3 good, responsible non-drinking and with professional skills. But if anything, until the ambulance will call, and until that will come. We're more reliable here, and the old lady asked for the deed. She doesn't look like an old lady, Vanessa said doubtfully. We did the usual things, washed the tents and corridors to a shine, cleaned the plumbing, served and took out the ship, fed the bedridden. But thoughts of the office kept up. I don't know about Vanessa, but I wondered how it was that she agreed to change her apartment, probably huge, well-maintained, but living with us. Why does she only have a grandson? Where are the children? Will she be too capricious? It's still unpleasant to be seen not as a human being, but as a low-level servant. The new girl refused to eat in the dining room and didn't ask me to bring her plates to her room. How did the grandson leave? We didn't see. But after lunch, the new lady was visited by Kevin. He stayed with her for quite a while and came out with a strange look on his face. Very often I've seen him close the door to a sick person as if he were closing a page. His expression changes immediately, and he hurries off to do other things. Sometimes comes out irritated. At times there is a sigh of relief, but from Moelala he came out pensive. He started booing something light. Then he shook his head, laughed, and went on his way. He closed the door to his office carefully. We didn't visit the new girl until evening. Her room was cleaned. Molly is a walker, so our help was not needed. I stopped by to call her for dinner. My shift was ending. After dinner, Lucy, the night nurse, came on duty. When we heard my knock, yes, I quietly opened the door and peeked in. Molly was sitting in front of me and styling her hair. Her gray hair in a high wave. The overhead light was out. Only the table lamp on the table was lit and picture frames appeared on the nightstand. A shawl was thrown on the headboard, blue with long tassels. It was no longer a ward, but a room. "Shall we eat in the dining room?" I called, and after a short pause, I added, "Or shall I bring it to you here?" Molly looked at me carefully. Daria suddenly turned to me, and I was surprised that she remembered my name so easily and spoke to me as if she had known me for a long time. "You're busy tonight." All my surprise is gone at once, and it's beginning, I thought. "Help me unpack, unpack, unpack." I'll read, like scratch my back. Well, I let Lucy do it, but Molly didn't let me think long about what duty she wanted me to do. "Would you go to the movies with me?" she asked. That's not what I expected. The last time I'd been to a movie a couple of years ago, our guests hadn't even thought about it. There was a nice plasma TV in the living room. Sometimes they fought over the programs. Some wanted to watch a movie, some wanted to watch the news, and some wanted to watch a soccer match. Molly had her own TV in her room. What about it? I was confused. They won't let you go, I guess. They can't, but this isn't a hospital. Molly grinned. I'm perfectly capable. It's different if you're expected at home. I can go alone, but the company's a different matter. I've never had small children. Andrew, I'll explain it all sometime, especially as time went on and we became more and more estranged, so the movie theaters are far away. I continue to be perplexed. I'm not even close. We'll call a cab, Molly said conspiratorially. What time did you get off? 8 o'clock. I couldn't get my act together. So we'll go to the last session. Come on, finish up. I'm waiting for you. God be with you. I don't need any help. When you're done, get dressed and come back for me. What movie do you want to see? Tula waved his hand. You know, I don't want to see a cheesy melodrama anyway, but anything will do. I'm just in the mood tonight. As a girl, when I was sad, I'd beg my mother for a few hryvnias and went to the movies. I'd be very grateful if you keep me company. Anna didn't let me down. When I went to her door at the beginning of the 9th, she answered me already dressed, in her light-colored cloak. Elegant hats, even gloves, were on her hands. It was a strange feeling to stand there, as if with a girlfriend, waiting for a cab to pick us up, to go to the movies, to let ourselves be entertained. I had the feeling that this had not happened in my life for 1,000 years. I didn't feel like I was accompanying an old lady at all. The residents of the nursing home. I know that Seva will be fine, Anna said. But it's still hard to part when he is going so far away. Of course, we will contact each other every day by email. We will, of course, email each other every day. Oh, Grandma again, I thought. So the laptop I saw on her desk is not a toy or a tribute to fashion at all. And your grandson? Where are his parents? Frank was raised by me, but my daughter died very young. Pneumonia in the hospital, and the doctors didn't save her. I didn't ask about Frank's father. More than half of my Russian girlfriends have children alone. The cab driver, a young guy, who arrived in a silver Priora, ran us to the lobby. In 10 minutes, Anna didn't need any help. A little upset, she jumped out of the car. And it was impossible to imagine that she would behave in a large shopping center as a grandmother, who God knows how long has not gone out. More like me. There were 2 ways to get up to the 4th floor, where there were cinemas and cafes, either by escalator or elevator. We headed for the glass elevator car. The elevator was made. So interesting that it looked like the cabin was going straight down into the fountain. Tourist-style metal, glass, and jets of water. We were going up to the 4th floor, and I noticed Anna's small hands in lacy black gloves. It seemed to me that as we walked out, she would take me under her arm confidently and lightly, like her companion. But it didn't take a cloud for her to read me. We were standing in front of the ticket office. Well, asked Anna what we were going to watch. Since the time is late, no children's sessions and fairy tales will obviously not be in their program. We'll have to choose between this and that. She nodded at two brightly colored posters. But please, no animation. I can't stand animation. It smelled like popcorn and warming butter. The clerk, though tired, looked at us curiously a couple times. The door to the small, cozy movie room was open. We picked out the odd movie. Liam Neeson, an almost gray-haired artist, played the owner of a funeral home. On his iron table was a girl in a red dress who had just been in a car accident before our eyes. The girl assured him she was alive. Liam Neeson convinced her that she had passed away and showed her the death certificate. It's just that her death was so sudden that to this day her soul is still sort of between two worlds. And he, the owner of the funeral home since childhood, is endowed with a mysterious gift to see such souls, to communicate with them. The mystery was that, and we viewers to the end could not understand whether the girl is alive, as it is undoubtedly, believes she herself, or Liam Neeson is actually her killer, set up all this coincidence. Now, the girl escapes from the funeral home. She's moving toward home for some reason. She appears and disappears like a ghost. And then she comes back, and she says, in a low voice, "I'm weaker." No wonder the undertaker answered her, "Your time is almost up. I love this artist. He's one of a kind." In any case, he embodies such images that it is not at all scary to walk next to him, holding his hand or holding his back and looking at life itself as a movie. No matter what happens, dangerous bad things will not affect you. Suddenly I didn't feel good. A bad or some strange anxiety came over me. "What's wrong with you and your anxiety?" asked Anna, looking into my face. The lights were on in the hall. "You're all sweaty." "Wait, I'll get some tissues." She unzipped her small purse, took out a pack of paper napkins and handed them to me. I tried to smile at her, but the smile came out crooked, and my fingers trembled. When I pulled out the napkin, "Oh, you were shaking. Let's go somewhere else," he said worriedly. "Let's sit down. I think there's a cafe nearby. Do you need something to drink? But don't worry, for God's sake. It's a small thing to me in the sense of money. There's something wrong with you. I can see that. Come with me." She was the one who kept me going when we went to the cafe. She chose a table in the corner and ordered. If I had been alone, I probably would have sighed at the price of each cup of coffee and chosen the cheapest. Anna ordered us ice cream. "You have glasses." It was sprinkled with chocolate and nuts over a high-priced cup of coffee and a glass of red wine. All this was placed in front of us by an obliging waiter. Very young, maybe a part-time student. He bowed slightly and disappeared. We were almost alone in the cafe, unless you counted the bartender behind the glass counter. There behind the walls was my favorite, the month wistful and endless. And here in the ghostly flicker of lights in the semi-darkness in the whispered voice of the singer in French, I could already feel the holiday. And after the new year, as we know, will come spring. Anna was picking up coffee grounds and foam with a spoon. "Do you want to tell me what happened? What's got you so worried?" I took a sip of wine. Red, sweet, fortified. I didn't know what would help me now. Anna looked at me and turned the conversation around. "You're probably wondering why I'm here, aren't you? Well, I kind of wanted to. Imagine, I'm a girl from a military family used to move from city to city. I couldn't sit in one place for a long time, and then I had to choose the same job. First, I worked in a magazine with a camera, traveled all over the country. It was hard to get out of the country back then. Not only did you have to be politically above board, you had to have a chance. As they say, the stars aligned in the sky. But I'm very grateful to fate for that time. I've been where today's travelers are unlikely to go. They may have traveled around Europe and Asia, marveled at Easter Island. But here in this vast, undiscovered country, you can be Columbus the discoverer. And this is what the world looks like when the sun goes down. In the summer, I used to wander barefoot in the shallows by the sea on a dare. We didn't live long, but we lived in the deep taiga, like on an island. And what are the nature reserves worth? To get a good shot, I'd go where men wouldn't dare to go. I was jokingly called a mountain goat. I saw a crocodile a few meters away. Not in a zoo, but in the taiga. Everything that man can master from the cave city to the caves. It's also a whole world of wonder. There is a feeling of complete detachment from reality, as in space. And the scenery around is completely alien. When my Natasha was born, I had to stay at home. I still did not think that babies will be good in expeditions, intense by the fire. And then I started writing books. It fascinated me so much that I no longer regretted that my life had changed. After all, the journey to which our imagination sends us, they are not inferior to real ones. I saw a lot of things and I wanted to share them. And my heroes could have had much more heroic fates. What are their prototypes? My husband. You're going to ask about him too. We were a kind of tandem. He's a journalist for the same magazine. I'm a photographer. He didn't believe I could write at first. I'd only ever captioned photos before. We've been around each other too much. But what beauty is there when in the morning, climbing out of the tent, we are not yet honest? After 10 days of camping, after sitting by the fire, you have to have eyebrows as red as a grouse. You could say we sought each other in our underwear. And now I was back in front of him in my underwear when he left. A robe over a nightgown. Nancy clutched to his chest. And there's a young girl, an aspiring journalist he met in the newsroom. Of course, he found her much more seductive than me, whom he knew inside and out, so to speak. And then there was a period when I was getting on my feet in literary terms, writing my first things. I hadn't been published yet, and then the first stories began to appear in magazines. It's not a quick thing. As long as you write a manuscript, send it in, submit it, it gets accepted. That's if you're lucky. And they decide to put in such and such a number, such and such a number. Maybe in a few months or maybe next year. Anyway, I remember that scene so well. When Nancy arrived, it was already 15. So he hadn't seen her in years. It's like getting to know a stranger and yet knowing it's a stranger to you from the closest person in the world. Father and daughter in that new family, he had 2 sons. And here we are sitting in the kitchen. What was that scene? I already had a full-time job, of course, another literary magazine. I'm a member of the Writers' Club. I needed these crusts, actually, to collect materials for my next things. I didn't give up my camera. It used to serve as my eyes. But now I could see with my inner eye much more than what the optics could capture. And still a camera to the rescue. I didn't look so bad. When a person is passionate, he can be anything. But still this aura around him, this light, because in front of a person, as if a light is burning, he lives not like most people, as if a day-to-day, when as if a day-to-day just lives, he goes to the goal so beautiful for him. And now the flame of this goal seems to light the way not only for him, but also for others. What's beside him? Nancy Anna a little audibly, sighed half-heartedly. A small and so serious little man, such big eyes clear. It's not that she studied perfectly. She finished school with a medal, then geological, with a red diploma. It's just that at that time, she had her whole childhood with her. That's how children divide the world into good and bad, fair and square. Valor and meanness is a very strict judgment for us adults, without any compromise there. In this case, she ran her dry palm over the smooth surface of the wooden table. And there was no one to judge. Sitting in front of us is a Mujikanka like this. You may not believe it, but it was hard for me to even imagine that he was once my husband, has long been on paperwork correcting other people's manuscripts. He doesn't write, but sits down. I guess his young wife demanded this sedentary life. And what expeditions? Now they have to feed, secure loans, pay from paycheck to paycheck, to patch holes in the budget, and these small worries gnaw at him like mice. His face is already wrinkled, and as if he has not been happy or admired anything for 1,000 years. As it turned out, we had nothing to talk about. He awkwardly asked Nancy if she needed anything. And she said she didn't need anything. I mean, what can you ask of a man like that? It's like a donkey pulling a cart with heavy sacks, and you dump another sack on it. And then another. Yes, Nancy always settled for something small. She didn't care what kind of boots she wore, as long as they didn't leak. And her hair was like that. It's rare to see a braid as thick as her arm nowadays. But to tell you the truth, I didn't feel guilty about her directly, that I didn't give her anything in life. I was doing it all for her. She didn't need much, and I didn't need much. And the fact that she had listened to my stories since she was a child. She wanted to be a vagabond too. She was also drawn to the road. And then it seemed to me that she repeated my fate under some crazy copy of the expedition. Eyes wide open with delight. The harshest conditions didn't frighten her. And love again. Only this one turned out to be married. Tula ran her hand across the table again. Nancy arrived from her expedition, pregnant, and as in a bad movie, his daughter came to her, waved about 8 years old. Only a huge white blouse, she said, and her voice was ringing and trembling. Auntie, I want to ask you very much. Don't leave me and my mom or dad. We love him very much. I guess her mother taught her to do that. Well, Natalia remembered how she herself had done in life, how she grew up. I guess somewhere in her heart she wanted to have a daddy too. Well, she broke up with this man forever. She just closed the door in front of him and said it's none of his business what happens to her next. And it was bad, I guess, for me. It was my business. And for her he served as a light. And when that flame went out, Natasha and I became as if extinguished. She's so thin. And soon after she gave birth to a son from her first illness, she died. We used to be able to get pneumonia and recover. We get back on our feet. And then there's a big city and hospitals and IVs and professors. And I kept Nancy. I had to hold on so that no one would even think that my grandmother would not be able to raise a grandson. So I held on. I adopted a boy. It was possible to raise him so that he wouldn't know his mother at all. And his father even less. He had no memory of his own. But I used to tell him about Nancy and what she was like, and how she grew up, and where we went with her, and the funny things that happened to us. The kids love it. They ask me a lot. Tell me about when I was little, he asked me. Tell me how little mommy was. Thank God, he wasn't interested in geography, but in languages. He was fluent in French by high school. And I'm only for the special school tutor Foreign Language Institute. That's how he got into the institute, and my whole began to fall apart like a house of cards. Everything I was holding on to. And I began to make friends with doctors more and more often, especially after the heart attack. And now my grandson is a translator for a large company sending him to Paris for 6 months. He'll have to translate documents there. And he's like, I'll leave you, Mom. He calls me Mom too. It's just so unusual to call me Mom with a name. What if at night you don't have the strength to call an ambulance? I convince him that I'm going to write a new book. It's better than any pills. As long as I'm writing it, I'm holding on. I've checked. And he can't leave if I don't feel good about you. I'd rather not. That's when I came up with this boarding house. I don't need much. It's a private room. Only because I need to be alone when I'm writing. Otherwise, I'm always in public. If there's anything I need help with, I guess. When my grandson comes home, of course I'll come home. Your ice cream glasses have long since been emptied. The coffee was drunk. Anna ordered another glass of wine. Starting a conversation is always difficult. At least for me. I'm always the one who gets the first sentence. It comes out so clever. It's hard to even understand what I'm trying to say. But this time, I guess I can't look as far ahead as you do. I said, not looking at Anna and twirling the spoon in my hands. I know it's silly, I guess. But I think my family life is going down the drain. I told you everything. There were no secrets to hide. Anna reached out her hand as if she wanted to cover my hand with her palm, but at the last moment she changed her mind. And that's good, because I don't like to be reached. Anna drummed her fingers on the table. And you intend to forgive all this? She asked. Or do you only blame yourself? I shook my head. I have a strange feeling. I just can't think about the future. You're right, Anna said thoughtfully. And your doubts don't seem delusional to me. Let's think about it. Maybe you should go away and live separately. To start all over again, he answered himself. It's unlikely. You have no home now, no job other than this one. You don't have any money set aside for emergencies. No, I shrugged. Of course, I could do something, like rent a room. Here in this city, I need to sort myself out. Something's going on in my soul. Has his attitude towards you changed since that incident? I think I'm becoming less and less his wife, more and more a stranger. Sweet boy, the waiter came to tell us it was 10 minutes till closing time. We paid. Calling a cab, Anna asked, "And thank you for telling me everything. We'll figure something out together." A few days later, I realized I was pregnant. I felt awful. My head felt heavy all the time, nauseous, and the day ahead of me with its 1,000 responsibilities. There was little hope in 2 cups, tea, coffee, and a couple of pills, which I always kept in my purse. And the golden autumn lived its life. The day outside the window is gray, cold slush, and I crossed the threshold and smells of milk porridge and pierogi. Warm on the shelf, waiting for me light blue slippers. Our old people are just waking up, but the hallway was already brightly lit. As I passed the hallway, I thought that on Christmas Eve, the Christmas tree would flash its lights mysteriously. And we will put presents under it, as we did last year, for all the inhabitants of our house. They'd be delighted at the very sight of those shiny boxes tied with bows. But not everyone can go down the hall. So Vanessa changes into her Santa Claus costume. Because of her size, she's always Santa Claus. And we'll go to those who can't get out of bed. And not everyone's relatives are coming. New Year's Eve is a busy time for everyone. And just give yourself a break. You want not to get up from the couch, stupidly watch TV. I can understand that. I would right now too. Aside from the ceiling of little daily chores, change diapers, wash, handle, feed, mop the floors. There were some extra chores today. Wendy made a house call to the ENT doctor for today. She was very annoyed that her hearing was dropping, and a barber was to visit us that day to give haircuts to all the men and women who wanted them. We called a barber once a month. I wanted to stop by Anna's house to say hello and ask how she was after yesterday. After all, for an old woman, half a bottle of wine in one person is a healthy violation of her diet. But Anna was still asleep. I saw only the motionless outlines of her fragile figure under the blanket. It was a rough night tonight, Lucy complained, turning in. Why? Vanessa asked. We were changing into our nurse's uniform, a short robe and pants. But for Vanessa and her figure, it was more appropriate to call them pants. So did Lucy hold out? She sat in our tiny cubbyhole and took her time getting up from the couch to change. First, this new grandfather on the second belly suffered James from Ward 8. Vanessa never confused anyone. She memorized all our new residents at once. Yeah, he's breaking it from the semolina. And he didn't say anything to anyone. And his family didn't tell him. And that's what we had for dinner. I changed his diaper 4 times last night. He won't stay in a dirty one for a minute. Weak old man. And what a voice. And how stupid everything is, and people talk loudly. And here she's screaming all the way down the hall. Lucy, sign it. I'm shitting myself again. It's a good thing he was in bed. I would have collapsed by morning. And Wendy put on quite a show. First, she demanded I take her blood pressure. Then her heart was racing. Gave her some drops. Then she wants her blood pressure taken again, and she better call Kevin to come over. Because I've seen enough. You're waiting here? You can't wait till we're all dead. Less work. What a parasite. Vanessa couldn't take it anymore. Aha. And now she, after her night concert, which is not by request of workers, crumbles to her. The doctor will come today, and you'll find yourself to blame again. I'm just making eyes at you. And here you are disturbing me with your buckets and mop. How do I understand her relatives? Who would chew on such a girl? Can she stand it at home? The day rolled on, but thoughts did not go out of my head, and that in normal times, and things that in normal times wouldn't be annoying, which I would have laughed at this time, forced me to be silent and not to snap. Chuck and William, when I scrubbed their floors, once again argued Chuck all his life, and in recent years, and especially was convinced that there was no more terrible strain in life, more tremendous work than the war. That was the first time I heard that from him, by the way. And what do you think? A daughter and a battle is work, hard work. And between battles, we never let the shovel out of our hands. Digging and digging trenches. It was a pity to leave them when we had to. And such labor, especially in winter, was freezing on the ground. And how many days we didn't sleep on the move. Supported each other by the hands on the march. About us. You probably didn't even think that we also plow with our last strength. Where are the horses? William was getting hot. Don't you want a lumberjack? Or our army didn't need wood? Or were we not a labor front? Only the horses were spared more than us. I had to have a hernia operation. I was already in the hospital, but only some scum bribed him to take my place. And I had huge trees to fell. I got there and watched these logs floating down the river, and I had no strength to stand up. The wind shook me, and yet death was not standing over you every minute. Chuck shook his head. There's one kid I won't forget. He wasn't 18 years old yet, probably, and so he wanted to lie behind my machine gun. I let him. As long as there was a lull, no bread yet. I didn't realize that the machine gunner was being hunted. I turned around with an empty kitten, and he was lying there. A sniper's bullet right in his forehead. And death didn't hunt for us. And death didn't hunt for us. William exploded. Did you even have a hero? At least you knew your mother and wife would get a funeral. Got a brave death. And from us it didn't come. They died like flies. They were treated like flies. So, in general, they swatted the grave. When else will the relatives find out if they dare to ask? From illness, from hunger, from weakness at work. The Urkas will slaughter him. There were 1,000 reasons. You've been eating your lunch out of a pot. And as a great favor, when we were on kitchen duty, we were allowed to lick the kettles of convicts in the hermitages. They're empty, but the walls shine. It is the bosses can soup a few spoonfuls at the bottom or porridge to the walls burned. It depended on it whether we survived or not. And you'll never get that shame out of my soul. And now, when my granddaughter asks me, why didn't you, grandfather, fight in the war? What could I tell them? Practical Chuck was a very kind man. He didn't want to argue at all, especially not with William. They agreed on a lot of the same books, loved the same books, remembered the same things about our town. When one of them felt unwell, the other would rush for the nurse or Kevin to call for help. We had our kinks, of course, he agreed. And you can tell your granddaughter that you did a lot as a labor front, too. You were rehabilitated. It must have been a small thing. The carelessness of denunciation. I didn't want to snitch, and what's 8 years for espionage? And that my father and brother were taken in my case and both stayed in the camps. My father, an old village teacher, died in a lumber camp. Foresaw his end, wrote William, I feel I'm going to die soon. Slowly preparing my mother for this thought. He died on a steamship on his way to Magadan. We got the certificates afterwards. Buried at sea. I did little flooring in their room. I knew in advance what each of them would say. Tula I saw already after lunch our old men were stretching from the dining room, and I recognized among them at once. She had as straight as a back and walked slowly only because Wendy was in front of it. Anna saw me too. She called out to me, It'll be a minute. Come to my place. I want to offer you something. There was a time when I couldn't imagine my life without working within 4 walls. After a while, I'd start to flounder. By the end of the vacation, I was bored, but I could do without work now. There was a lot less energy. I would find something to occupy the day and take my time rising and drinking the cup of coffee in a chair by the window with sunlight on my eyelids. Over the years, the imagination develops more and more. And even in solitary confinement, a person does not get bored. After all, one closes his eyes and such pictures appear before him. But maybe, despite all the dirt, all the hard work every day, I am drawn into my work anew. And by the middle of the day, I already begin to love it, because it is impossible not to perceive our house, otherwise as a big family. Today, me and the girls, well, I mean Vanessa, Nurse Kate, Nina, and I stood in the hall and discussed such an exhibition. We're going to do one for Birthday Boys Day. We have one every month. We should catch our old people and take pictures of them so they're as touching as they are in real life. Not just, a face like a passport. We glued them on some large paper boards, and we will write wishes and gifts for each of them near each photo. We should think about it too, Mina said. I've already agreed with a confectionery factory in the form of charity. They will give us candy, so we'll have sweets. All old people like sweets. But to think of some little things to make them happy, Wendy. Helen to buy a package, advised Vanessa. to poke them in the face with the harmful ones they're so excited about. Yes, these ladies will not please. Agreed Nina. And today this Kelly came. Who's who? Yeah, a girl. She's young. She looked at Wendy, gave her these funny candles. You put them in bouche, and then you light the edges. They're long. And the flame heats up or something. It has this healing effect. So you know where Wendy told her to put those candles. I guess, Nina grinned. You got him by the nod, Vanessa. It's kind of forbidden to swear bad words here, but for her the rules of social life are not an issue. Wait till Helen makes the hairdresser cry, and there will be a full conflict. At least I know what to get Helen, laughed Kate. A glass with a cup underneath. You know, the kind you get on a train, say, from Russian railroads. She'll be touched. There had been more going on in Martha's life lately than in her entire life. She had gotten used to the idea that life would drag on, taking its time and nothing interesting would happen to her. If you thought that way, it made no difference whether you were 20, 30, or 50 years old. In any case, there was another piece of life ahead, which, obviously, would pass in the same way. It was only Mom's cats that were more or less dynamic. And there were kittens in the house, sometimes completely blind and helpless, who had to be taken care of like everyone else. You had to take care of them like all small children, to get up for hunger cries, even at night to warm milk or mixture from a syringe with the needle removed, to warm a film on the radiator, to wrap them in a warm one. They were given sick or mutilated animals. It was painful to look at, and they took them to the veterinary clinic, nursed them back to health after surgeries, gave them shots, washed their eyes, pumped their ears. The happiest thing was to give their pets to new owners, if there was someone who wanted to take them. After all, the animals were all unbred. But cats are amazing. Even if you had to climb for them in a dirty basement, and there they sat and looked at a man with the same haughty, truly royal look. People should learn such a sense of dignity. Martha had a pet, which was already clear that it would stay with them forever. The cat named Bro was middle-aged, striped, and catastrophically fat. His mom had looked him up outside the chicken store, where she buried the backs of her many feline family members for soup. Next to the door lay a fat cat in a collar. Mom bent down to pet him and read the sign on the collar that said, "Good, please don't feed him. He's on a diet." The owner's home address and phone number were listed too. The cat looked at the woman carefully, saw nothing from Yasnov in her hands, and lost interest in her. Then my mother saw Brove more than once, and then met in the same store in line for chicken with his mistress, already not young, but very anxious. "We're going away," she complained. "My mother-in-law is having a stroke. We're moving in with her. I'll take care of the old lady. Only the cat can't stand it. Where will I put the Bro? I don't know. Such a smart, soulful cat. And what did you feed him so?" Perplexed Lilia. "How many cats do I keep? But I have none. Yes, he eats no more than any other cat. The doctor said he had a metabolic disorder and had to go on a diet. No more sour cream, no more cream. And there's the chicken. Fished specialty food additives." Lily kept her eyes on Bro for a couple more days. Then she wrote off his collar and called his landlady's cell phone number. She couldn't bear the thought that such a colorful and affectionate animal would end up on the streets. In the new house, Armour did not quarrel with anyone, fed him separately as he ate without hurrying to taste. At this time, other cats, already finished with their portions of Sambo, leading revenge torpedoes, rushed to his bowl. And who was the first to eat? The one who ate. All fiercely spoiled-fed cats lily well, but those who had recently been homeless, there was still a reserve, left appetite for Bro, sat next to him, watched how strangers spread with his food, and confused politely poked Ammer. And then he followed his masters. He looked into their eyes almost humanly expressive and said meow, saying, "I am hungry." That's when Martha took him into her care. Since then, I personally Bro's saucer stood on the windowsill, and Martha stood next to him while he ate, driving away from other applicants. And Brock spent all the time that he didn't eat or visit the cat litter box in Martha and bed, sprawled out on the pillows. What does it say about lonely women and kitties? Sad thought Martha, especially about old maids. She had already resigned herself to the idea that no one would ever fall in love with her. She looked in the mirror for a couple of minutes a day, just to see if her hair was okay. Could she go to work like that? She perceived her apparent lack of beauty as a kind of justification for her loneliness, as an order from above. You have a different destiny, and there's no need to get involved in family life. Lily could never buy her anything that made Martha stand out, that she liked, and her clothes were the most modest. As Martha thought to herself over the refectory, perhaps now. When Martha was already working, she could go shopping and pick up a more colorful and fashionable closet. Well, at least on sale. But it never occurred to her. Finding herself in any large shopping center, she either hurried to the grocery department or dared to go into the household of all these stores and stores, where behind the glass doors rows of skirts hung in rows and feathers stood in rows of boots. It was hardly as if the friendly girls were shying away from them. She subconsciously waited for them to say to her, "Where are you going with your pig's snout?" Sometimes she allowed herself to sit in the center of such a store on special benches for visitors. Even it was a kind of immersion in luxury. The floors shone, on which on special cars from time to time drove cleaners. Murmuring fountain burned a lot of lamps, was always warm, even in winter. To the right carried delicate aromas. There was a department where they sold handmade soap. To the left floated the smell, the freshness of roasted coffee. Nearby, a small kiosk sold dressed-up ice cream, pink and yellow, green, brown, raspberry lemon on Tashkova, chocolate balls in Athens cones. Opposite, sparkled unbearably rings earrings, necklaces in the jewelry department. Passing by, chirping tall girls with long legs, heeled boots, loose hair. They were so young, so confident. Martha rose heavily, picked up the bag that stood at her feet, bread, cotton laundry detergent, otherwise the smell from the cats would not go away. And going home wouldn't even occur to her. It would have seemed an unthinkable dare to go on a trip. She'd never even seen the sea. Maybe if her mother hadn't started this shelter at home, Martha would have thought about it. What's her excuse in life? Not the numbers she puts into the computer every day at work. The strongest feelings Martha experienced were given to her by books. She was not distinguished by exquisite taste in reading since childhood, swallowed what she could get her hands on in the library. With the advent of the internet, she moved there for her birthday. Her mom got her a cheap laptop. And Martha liked horror stories, all sorts of epics about vampires, werewolves, and bloody villains. She could never identify with the heroine of a love novel because she thought that the image of a gray mouse with her blatant beauty would be too fat for her. But the atmosphere of anxiety, the mystical creatures, the climax of horror gave life the same spice to life as spices to a pleasant dish. And one could be sure. After work, you'd find Martha hogging the corner of the bed, and next to her a brio and a plate with a couple of sandwiches. Martha, or reading away and won't let go until she's done, or watching another movie from the thrillers and horror section. The only friend Martha had was her neighbor Daria, though she was younger, but she was someone she could talk to occasionally, invite unobtrusively for a cup of coffee. True, Daria had a very handsome husband, with whom Martha was always in a state of shock, and as she was visiting a neighbor, she hurried to leave. But when Daria said she was going to live somewhere else, Martha immediately felt uneasy. On the one hand, she shouldn't have cared. Daria has her own family. What did Martha have to do with it? On the other hand, it was a shame to lose her only friend. And Martha knew that Daria wouldn't just leave. After all, she and her husband had recently been newlyweds, dreaming of having children. Suddenly, Daria decided to move out. Maybe there was something she needed help with, and then Martha decided to go to Golden Autumn after work to find out. It was very unusual for her, a whole trip. It was already dark when she finally reached the boarding house with 2 transfers. How did she get there? She had to walk a long way where there were no sidewalks, and on the roadway she had to dodge cars. Several times Martha thought she was going to get hit, and then she breathed a sigh of relief as she walked up to the front porch of the boarding house. Who are you here to see? A woman who sat at the entrance behind a special counter and knitted. The janitor, probably not to be preserved, an old black woman with glasses. On the records, something white airy. It was very warm in the boarding house. It smelled of porridge. Martha didn't have to go anywhere far. She was glad she could ask right there at once. Tell me, please, I'm Daria Serebriakova's neighbor. She works here. My mom and I can't reach her. She's doing well. She goes to work as a janitor. She wanted to answer them. But there was a thin old woman walking down the hall. Her gray hair was styled in a high updo. The woman was carrying an electric kettle. She slightly covered her eyes and said to Martha, "Come with me, I'll tell you." Shoe covers, shoe covers. And the janitor shoved Martha a pair of shoe covers made of denim. Anna waited for her while Martha tied those purse shoe covers around her ankle. When she led her to her room, Martha looked around perplexed. Is this a nursing home? It's a luxury hotel. Such a big room. 2 windows, couch, flowers. It wasn't until Anna invited her in and Martha walked over and sat down that she saw a man sitting in the chair across from her. At the same time, he raised himself slightly, extending his hand to Martha, saying hello, and Anna introduced him. This is Kevin, our doctor. Briefly, she recounted the whole story to Martha. Daria had been brutally humiliated by her husband. And since she is an orphan, she has nowhere to go. So Anna offered to let her stay in her apartment for the time being. Martha was so shocked that she forgot about the interesting young man sitting across from her. Besides, she had a pattern. The more interesting the man, the more restrained she should be. The last thing she needed was for him to think she'd lost her mind. Freak. Who do you think you're imposing on? Dashka. She's like me, she'll stand up for herself. No way, Martha agreed. Kevin, you'll take the girl home. Sure. And that smile wasn't meant for Martha, of course. It was too much. It's how a man smiles at a woman. What kind of woman is Martha? In the car, Martha tried to behave as conspicuous as possible. She sat in the back seat, cowered in a corner, and kept quiet the whole way. All she said was where to go. All she wanted was to get there as soon as possible. She didn't even feel comfortable in the cab. What surprised her most was that when they arrived, Kevin got out of the car and went to walk her back to her apartment. She had a premonition that as soon as her mom opened the door, her nose would be hit with the cat smell. How much cleaning up after these cats? How much bleach? There's still a new one who has to be accustomed to the clutch. Did Kevin seem slow on the landing to you? Like he wanted to ring the doorbell where Daria no longer lived. Maybe he wanted to talk to her husband. But Kevin only nodded at Martha and started down the stairs. Kevin, on the other hand, thought to himself that Daria would never forgive him, and that it was a terrible thing to fall in love with a friend's wife. And he hardly knew her as a person on that unfortunate evening when the alcohol had played a cruel joke on him and her. What to do now? A serene life had long surrounded him. As a young boy, he had been sent by his parents to his grandmother's care, but it was not the village most of us imagine. At the word grandmother's village, my grandmother became the owner of her ancestors' dacha. Her grandfather, a rich factory worker, had built this wooden terem to bring his large family here for the summer. It stood on a mountain. There were countless balconies, cans, and a slab or two-story house, fanciful wooden lace. My grandfather built this house in 1915. From time to time, the house was painted according to what paint was available. And when in the 90s, grandmother proved that she is a direct heiress of that very factory worker. Local authorities were glad to give her the mansion promised finally. But maybe she'll finish it. At that time, it was scary to enter this place. On the main balcony, the wooden floors had almost collapsed. They had to be rebuilt. The roof was leaking. In the corridor, the pioneers crucified a big bag on a mop. Let them play the ghost, scare the entrance. Grandma sold her luxurious 5-room apartment in the city and invested all the money in rebuilding the family nest. Having finished with the urgent construction work, she even went into the subtleties, trying to return the house to its former appearance. She found a samovar at a jumble sale, then bought a piano with a candelabra from an acquaintance, who was also about to throw it away. Little Kevin could not quite appreciate the troubles of his grandmother, but the house played a big role in his fate, because he perceived it as a living being. Soon creaking became a sight to him. Every staircase step he and the night wake him suddenly, would unmistakably tell what is visible from the window of each room and how the sun wanders through it, at what time the sun peeks through the window, at what time it leaves the main balcony, on which, according to surviving memories of the family of the factory worker, drank evening tea. Before, there was a marvelous view of the plain. Now the trees had grown up around it. If there was anything to admire, it was the forest. But it was here that he had his encounter with the unknown beyond, which later led him to write books. Kevin believed that in the old fireplace lived the housekeeper. His presence was especially felt on the fairy tale days of Christmas, when there was a real hall here, a real Christmas tree, which also seemed to be about the shower bath. In the morning, she was streaked with light from the windows. She was a real forest fir tree. In the evening, however, it was especially bright with glittering rain and trees, drenched in silver and gold. It seemed magical. The houseboy didn't limit himself to a gift put in a special stocking at Christmas. And it was always something mysterious. An old picture night, a ship with a loaf sitting on its oars, and a girl standing in the stern with a lantern in her hand. It seemed you could touch those waves with your finger, that fire in the lantern, or the snow globe in the mesmerizing solitude of the girl sitting on the bench. She was ready to wait an eternity for someone to sit still like that. And the snowflakes kept swirling and swirling above her head. Kevin then was ready to break the balloon, so that the girl at least did not freeze to death or lay under the Christmas tree ornate box. The surprise clappers, each of which was a mystery in itself, and always this one turned out to be put in unnoticed by Kevin. He would, sometimes suddenly, wake up in the night and run to see if the present was already there or not. But he could never catch the houseboy coming. And in the pond behind the house, of course, there were mermaids. And Kevin could never look at the painting in peace, because I'm sure that's exactly what they had going on here. Only he never caught one. And when he was a boy, he often left it on the big mountain. The sun was not by the pond something for mermaids, a hair comb or an old grandmother's shawl. By morning, it was all gone without a trace. At the age of 5, he wrote his first story, dedicated to the same scoops. It was in the fall. He said goodbye to them for the whole endless winter, because who would want to beat the thick ice in one shirt to go ashore and sit in the freezing night, counting in the light of the month his long hair? Kevin went down to the ice more than once, kneeling down and wiping the ice as if he were wiping a window. But all he saw was a mask dead in the snow, a bubble of air. He hoped that a strange maiden face with expressive eyes would penetrate from that side of the ice, and he would understand without words what the mermaid wanted to tell him. He wrote his first stories, though in fact they were probably fairy tales, because they featured the same fairy tale characters, the good and evil spirits of Rusalka's old house, who lived in the old pond, a forest witch who has a hut somewhere in the sky that no one can find. But if you care, you're bound to stumble upon it. And then watch out. And over everything the spirit of the old house with its sturdy doors and other ladders hovered, with the wooden closet that smelled elusively of Grandma's old powder, her perfume with a month lingering in his bedroom window with yellowed tomes of books. When the boys he went to school with came to visit him, they would sit for long stretches of long December, January evenings by the fuel fireplace. That's when his story began. He didn't dare read them from his notebooks, but he told them, and the boys were infected and frightened. "How do you know about the witch?" Alex asked, flapping his nose. Kevin never admitted that it was all made up by him. "He told it all to my grandmother. Her grandmother used to tell her. It sounded convincing." And the boys immediately started arguing. "I'm telling you it's by the spring." Alex was hot. "My father and I went hunting when we went hunting. He didn't show me the hunting hut over there. It's abandoned now. That's where the witch lives." "Oh, come on." Mike mockingly contradicted him. "If it were so easy, I would have seen it 1,000 times already. And in fact, you meet her only if you get lost. You have no defense. You don't know where to run to people. That's when the witch comes for you." The boys were soaked. It was getting dark outside the window. And grandmother, who sat by the table and knitted attentively, listened to all this. She also collected notebooks, shoved them carelessly to her grandchildren, folded them, kept them safe. And then, leafing through these notebooks, written in childish handwriting, horrified and ashamed of his naivety, He still no. And he drew from them some ideas that could only come to a child with his imagination. And without realizing it himself, he tried his best to keep that child in him. And yet at first, at his grandmother's request, he got a real profession. He graduated from medical school. He had a rare gift, a brilliant photographic memory. It was enough for him to read a textbook, and he could, closing his eyes, retell what was written there at the exams without any problems. Fortunately, the university had brilliant teachers and Kevin was fascinated by his studies. He graduated, worked in a hospital for a few years, then moved to a boarding house as a doctor to the elderly. But in parallel, he continued to write. His road in literature was relatively successful. After years of refusals, not recognizing poisonous criticism without despair, and the desire to give up everything, he began by winning one literary contest or another. Then there was a novella describing a 19th century boarding house. The girls are taken out of town to a farm where they will spend the whole summer swinging on swings, catching butterflies with a net, reading poetry, and strolling through the alleys under an umbrella. This idyllic picture is shattered by a new pensioner who has just returned from Hungary with her parents. She is full of legends about the vampires, werewolves, and other non-good things there. At first, the girls listen to her stories as scary fairy tales and assure her that here in the wilderness nothing like that can be. But soon Maria comes to a different conclusion. She knows the signs that the girls ignore. Maria realizes that the vampires have reached those places, and if not to fight them, all awaits doom. And only she, knowing from ancient legends techniques to fight ghouls, manages to stop the invasion of the immortals. This story went to the readers and soon came out a separate book. And then there were more and more. If Kevin once dreamed of a bookshelf on which will stand only his books, then now much has already been written about the ideas in his head dreamed. What's a bookshelf for? A whole rack of books. But over all his works hovered the ghost of the old house. All the fears he so convincingly conveyed to others were born there. If he didn't get a line written in a day, it was an empty day. He was desperately sorry. It had faded into oblivion. Time, after all, could give birth to worlds, for could weave a shining web of intent and words. He did not understand people for whom it was natural and taken for granted to waste days and years going to work. Good, if more or less favorite, but more often the one with the heart he was indifferent to. And then to come back tired and live out the evenings at a desk, sitting in front of the TV or going out with friends, but not creating anything that time would preserve. Kevin considered such people the hotels of life, the mad motors of far more than had ever descended. And the hand of some madman in a casino. It was about life. Writing anything now. He asked his acquaintance when he had high hopes. Thoth looked away for a moment. But now you realize, brother, there's no time. But I have a book lying around that I've started. Kevin. I wanted to say that life will never give so much time that you can drown in your work. And a book forgotten for years dies, too. Its characters, it's made flat and cardboard. He sat down to his work at 4, giving it his best hours, when he had strength and his head was fresh, and got up having done what he set out to do. Then he could live like all normal people, work at his main job, meet with friends, go to the theater and stores. But more often than not, he didn't do it like everyone else. He went wandering wherever he could get something for his new thing. Even if not a picture that evoked this or that association. The thought of God knows how this mysticism of creativity originates. A branch of cotcha in the fall sky lit by a window snowcap on the ridge posts. Everything could miraculously be reborn, become a page in a book. And you don't get bored sitting in this town for years. A schoolmate once threw it to him. He just told me how he'd come back from Spain near the hotel. There he lived as sunbathed, bathed, what he ate, where he went on excursions. He was rubbing his phone, showing countless pictures from the I'm in the Background series. He wanted to emphasize that if it weren't for the job he toils at from morning to night, there would not have been this 2-week trip to Barcelona in his life. And from the thrust of the full, Kevin took off his glasses. They were sitting in a cafe that, contrary to the trends of the time, had been there for 50 years. Their parents used to come here for tea and chocolate scrap when they were students. Then they themselves used to come here for coffee and condensed milk during their college years. It was also glorious. Coming back from the movie theater, freezing to a state or hole. Running in here and getting an empty, steaming cup in their hands. The same were now standing in front of Arseny and his companion. Even the cups haven't changed. What do you think it's like to live a boring life without going anywhere? He asked again. How did you come to be so spiritually poor that you are bored with yourself? He wanted to say that he too was going to the Iberian Peninsula someday, to stand outside the cathedral in honor of the Holy Family and hear the wind singing, resonating off the towers. Antoni Gaudí thought that the music of the Creator himself would be heard here. You can't record such a thing on a tape. But he held back and kept silent. Suddenly did not realize by his friend it was secondary to the quality of the hotel, where to live and the food, which could be tasted and admired or bypassed in a foreign country. Anna, with whom he was separated by years of generation, was closer to him in this respect, and of course, when she asked him for any favor, he was always happy to try to fulfill her request. But when Martha got into his car, this not very young and not at all pretty girl wrapped her arms around herself, an instinctive gesture that shows one is closed to socializing and talking, a gesture of don't touch me. It made him look at her more closely. There was that depth and subtlety in her that meant beauty to him in the first place. And she was helpless, so helpless. He felt like walking her back to her apartment, leaving her already safe. And then he was coming home and already approaching the entrance. He looked up at his windows. He always left a light on in the hallway. And now he saw the clear silhouette of a dog standing with its front paws on the kitchen windowsill. The dog was gazing at the subject outside the window waiting. I was unspeakably lucky. I realized that my job had to be changed immediately for several reasons. And because of the fact that I am now not allowed to do heavy physical labor. And when you're caring for the sick, you can't do it. But most importantly, I didn't want anyone to know about my pregnancy except Anna. And first of all, Kevin. It would have been a horror of horrors for me, as the young people say. If he had to go against his feelings and marry me like a decent man, I no longer hoped to find a suitable place for me. When I saw an announcement that a small store needed Florescu, I went for an interview and quite unexpectedly I got the job. And I warned the owner that I was pregnant. But she said if everything is good with my health, I will try to reduce the maternity leave to a minimum. I will give almost everything that I earn nanny, but work will not quit. And I got the go-ahead. It was as if I got to my favorite profession and worked frantically self-consciously. I came long before the opening of the store and stayed in it until almost midnight. Good thing the smell of flowers didn't irritate me. In a small pool in the middle of the hall floated roses. I pulled them out of the absorbent cotton, fresh, as if they'd just been plucked from the bush and dewdropped. With my first paycheck, I rented a small studio apartment near the store. I thanked her for being kind enough to let me stay with her and gave her back the key to the apartment. Honey, you still don't want to tell Kevin? Anna didn't go on. She knew I'd figure it out. No, I said firmly. And your husband, Andrew? I've only heard rumors, and believe me, he started courting our neighbor Martha. Poor girl. I remember her, Anna said thoughtfully. She used to come to see me. Poor thing, she had such a battered look. That's why he chose her. I said. He has a thing about children, some kind of mental disorder. He's incapable of procreation himself, but he wants a submissive wife who will do whatever he says, spend the night with whoever he says or does. I feel sorry for Martha, but she seems to be in love and won't listen if I tell her the truth. But you can sue for housing. I guess that's what I'll do. I've been thinking, the apartment's in his name, but I put up my own money. I think I can prove it. I'll get over the whole thing and do it. When he said goodbye, he crossed me with a blessing. It's nearing the end of a gloomy autumn evening. Outside the window, the rain changed to snow and vice versa. I wasn't expecting anyone, unless some young man would run out to buy a rose to give to his beloved on a date. It was warm in the pavilion. I made several bouquets, which I expected to sell the next day. Quietly, the bell at the door jangled. I looked up. Kevin was standing in front of me. It was impossible to hide the pregnancy, but he wasn't looking at my changed figure. He was looking into my eyes. "Doria, will you marry me?" he asked. It was probably the most romantic setting, fragrant with roses and lilies, and then a declaration of love. I realized that Anna had broken her promise to keep quiet and told Kevin everything. Maybe I should have been proud, let him know that I would think about it. But I was waiting so long for those words that I could only nod. I hadn't seen Andrew for a long time, and even though we lived in the same town, he was out of my sight, and that was good. I did work until almost the birth, although Kevin asked me to leave the place and devote all my time to taking care of myself and the baby. In the early spring, I gave birth to a baby boy. Kevin had said many times that he dreamed of having a daughter like me, but he was happy when he held his son in his arms. On a lovely May afternoon, we were walking in the park with the stroller. Peter was a very calm baby. We had been walking for about an hour, and he was still dozing serenely. "Would you like some ice cream?" Kevin asked me. He went to the kiosk, and I stood in the shade and waited for him in the distance. I noticed another couple, Andrew and Martha. My poor girlfriend looked completely miserable. I realized that she'd heard her companion say something derogatory. Andrew met my eyes. No, he would not be able to subdue and break me again. I saw him bring his hand to his lips. He seemed to want to bite it, to hold back a cry of rage and indignation. Too happy. In his opinion, I had the look. I turned toward Kevin, who was approaching us with 2 ice cream sundaes.
Subscribe and click the bell.
Soon your station will be here, and through the door of my compartment the conductor announced, 10 minutes to go. Thank you, my good man. I picked up my valise and down the narrow corridor. While reading, sitting on the joints of the rails of the carriage, headed for the exit. The train slowed down. It jerked several times and finally, shrilly, with the wheels locking, came to a stop. The conductor wiped the handrails and helped me down the steep steps to the platform. The steam locomotive blew its whistle and the train shuddered. As you sang, an optical seizure began to slowly gain speed. Soon the last carriage disappeared around the corner. The clatter of the wheels ceased to be heard, and there was silence. I looked around. A small station, or rather, a half station, a wooden, in some places rotten platform, and a forest all around. I took out my watch and opened the lid. A quiet tune played. The time had long since passed 12 o'clock, and it was appropriate to think that evening would soon be upon us. I headed towards a small structure. Apparently, the station keeper's cabin. The door was locked. Everything about it said that trains rarely stopped here, and that the station master's position had long since been abolished for lack of use. I looked around, still not a soul in sight. To be honest, I felt a little creepy to be alone in an unfamiliar place. It was a rather dubious pleasure on the eve of evening. I walked around the cabin and saw an old inn going into the woods. Is there nothing to do? We must go. According to my calculations, the homestead should be somewhere about 5 kilometers from the railroad. After all, I have a revolver with me, and I'm not afraid of the nocturnal evil. I crossed myself and headed confidently toward the road, hitting the railroad embankment before heading deep into the woods. I stopped and pulled the revolver out of my valise, cranked the drum, checking the cartridges, and slipped the weapon behind my belt under my jacket. Well, can we go now? The inn was old, and it was obvious that it was rarely used. To the right and left grew tall mossy, spruce trees with their paws. There were pine trees all the way to the ground, but mostly I was surrounded by melnick. Elderberry bushes grew along the roadside, covered with bright red full berries. For some reason I remembered how as boys we used to spit unripe green berries through tubes, getting unimaginable pleasure from it. I imagined myself now with a buzina in my mouth, and it made me laugh. The road was mostly dry, but somewhere there were puddles, in some places quite large and deep. Sometimes there were boulders, brought here by the Olenek. They were neatly placed on the roadside, so as not to interfere with the passage. I looked under my feet for signs of hoofprints and wheels. There was no cart in sight. I walked not fast, swaying, my valise in time with the movement of the evening. The sun was slowly but inevitably retreating behind the trees. The pace was getting darker and there was no end of the road in sight. I began to look around for a place to stay for the night. I was born into a poor family. My parents were once serfs of the Vyazemsky princes. My mother was brought up by the Baron and was brought up in the best noble traditions. In time, the Baron himself laid his eyes on her, but his wife was vigilant, and as soon as she saw his sympathy, immediately sold my future mother to a neighbor, and the latter married her to his coachman Kevin. And that's how my mother became Marloslaw. Being a woman of purpose and firm character, she managed to re-educate her husband, my father, taught him literacy, and made him study. After liberation, my father engaged in selling hemp and pine resin for his wife's dowry, and with his savings he leased a large plot of forest, which once belonged to the same princes Vyazemsky. Gradually the trade began to bear fruit. My father became a millionaire and owned several cargo steamships on the Dnieper. We had a big house outside the city and a large apartment in Street Petersburg. I was the only child in the family, and my mother, a former serf, prepared me for university. But I wanted to be in the military. By that time, the rules for entering a military school had been liberalized, and they started accepting non-oblomen. My father paid the right people, and for 2.5 years I became a junker at the Vilna Cavalry School. After graduation, I was sent in the rank of lieutenant to the Smith Hussar Regiment, which was going to the Caucasus. Well, in fact, do not send to war scion of a noble family, such served only in the Guards. In the first battle at the storming of the fortified Al-Zatik, I was wounded. I spent a long time in the hospital until I was dismissed from the army. But I had no sooner returned home, as I was summoned to one institution and offered to serve as an official. I must say that the new service did not interfere at all with my commercial activities. By the time I returned from the army, the Vyazemsky princes were completely impoverished. The Baron's son Christopher started to trade, but quickly went bankrupt and mortgaged even the estate. His sister Lisa sat in her father's estate and, it seems, was preparing to become an old diva. There were no hunters for the young lady. Our house was not far from the prince's nest, and one evening, returning from hunting, I happened to see the young princess. I saw her and fell in love. I didn't chew the snot for a long time. A month later, I sent the matchmakers. You should have seen the old Baron and his son. They seemed to burst with anger, if only a former slave, to marry their daughter. The blue blood even boiled. I was about to be chased away, but my father politely explained to the food gentleman that he would give a course to their bills of exchange, and if they did not pay their debts, the estate would come to me. This is a matter for zealous princes. The end of the debate was put by the princess. She, paying no attention to the relatives, gave her consent to marry me, knowing perfectly well that she was losing her title and nobility. A month later, we were married in a small church. A month later, I took my young wife and left for the capital of the empire. Now, allow me to introduce myself. Marlowe Stephen. I'm a salesman of all kinds of collections. Yes, that's my specialty. You might also call me an antiques dealer, but that's a bit of a stretch. I search for, buy out collections that have already been collected by someone, and then sell them to amateurs. Expertise, evaluation is all mine. Understandably, I try to buy cheaper and sell more expensive. The difference is my income, but I always try to give a real price. Cheating is not my thing. Collections, any postcards, paintings, watches antique and not antique bronze, cast iron, musical instruments, bells, anything a person can be passionate about and collect. Believe me, there are some very unusual collections. For example, a collection of feathers. It would seem a trifle. What could be interesting in it? Not at all. I recently sold such a collection to a Street Petersburg object for very decent money. Or, for example, a collection of ships' helms and bells. I bought it from the widow of an old captain and sold it very profitably to a collector. He even almost fainted from happiness, so the money was not spared. I'm not talking about the gun collection. It's a gold mine. but I don't collect them myself. For me, it's only a trade item to be in the subject. I have to read scientific books and magazines, understand the types of iron casting, know the composition of ancient enamels and paints, be able to distinguish the original from the fake, sometimes very skillful. Some sellers go to all sorts of tricks and stratagems to sell their things more expensive, so you have to keep your eyes open. That night was no different from any other. Summer was fading, but it was still quite warm. Soon the cottagers would be back in town from their vacation, and my trade would be revitalized. I sat in front of the fireplace and smoked a cigar. I was leafing through a recent catalog from a Leipzig auction. As a rule, nothing of interest came up at these auctions, so a couple or three old canvases by unknown artists, some porcelain, and a covered green damsel, bronze. Complete collections of the subject of my commercial interest rarely pop up at these kinds of auctions. But this time I was interested in a small selection of jewelry, a few rings, necklaces, a couple of bracelets, white gold, and precious stones. In general, I do not like to fight at an auction, raising the bid to infinity. Generally, things are auctioned off to maximize profit. I don't know why I paid attention to the jeweler. I put aside the catalog and took the Jeller's handbook off the shelf. On antique jewelry and articles is very often found branding with the assay, an ancient Russian measure of weight equal to 1/6 of a pound. The gold or silver content of an alloy is determined by the amount of Zlotnikov maximum 96. For example, 50. A 6 gold assay means that there are 56 parts of gold and 96 parts of the alloy. The remaining 40 additives, the so-called literature. Thus, pure metal without any impurities corresponded to 96 gold pieces of gold, 24 carats. It should be said that the presence of gold in the alloy forms the price of the product, plus the work of the craftsman and so on. It's a bit boring, of course, but agree, valuable information, and for lovers of antiques, and for specialists. So all the products presented in the catalog were 92 OU sample, which in itself was unusual. Budget jeweler is usually not higher. The 56th grading had salt in the fireplace at night, and soon I dozed off with a book dropped in my lap. I dreamed of the goldsmith, new samples, and a roundel round my head. I was awakened by a knock at the door. On the threshold stood a rather decently dressed gentleman with an expensive English cane hanging from the curve of his left arm. The man inclined his head politely and asked if I could see Mr. Marlowe. "What can I do for you?" I replied politely. "We could talk." The man nodded toward the open door. "If you mean business, I don't do business at home. Come by the store tomorrow." I was about to close the door, but the man stopped it with the toe of his lacquered shoe. "Believe me, Mr. Marlowe, what I'm about to tell you will interest you." The man looked me straight in the face, and there was something in his eyes that made me shy away. Letting him into the apartment, we went into the hall, and I nodded to the visitor on a vacant chair. "Would you like a cognac or a cigar?" I tried my best to hide my irritation. "Thank you. Let's get down to business." The stranger sat down in the chair, leaning against its arm. "Allow me to introduce myself. Sam, Mr. Marlowe. I collect unusual sculptures. The means allow me to do so. They're not made of porcelain or metal. The object of my passion is human figures made of other materials, wax. For example, only wax can fully convey the beauty of the human body. All the more so now wax figures are becoming fashionable. But alas, wax figures do not last long. Even a simple change in air temperature can, if not destroy the figure, but to cause its noticeable damage. That's not the case with wood. Wooden sculptures can only be destroyed by fire, and if a wooden sculpture is properly treated, it can last forever. The stranger's eyes gleamed, reflecting the fire of the fireplace. "Do you want to sell me your collection?" I asked, blowing smoke out of my mouth. "No, I want to offer you to find something for me." "What do you mean?" My question sounded a little uncertain. "I want to ask you to visit Mr. Williams, or rather his estate." The fact is, the owner of the manor died recently, but I have information that he had a large collection of sculptures. There's no mention of it after his death, but it can't have just disappeared. You have to find it. I'll pay you good money." I could hear the excitement in the guest's voice. He was about to say something else. Lisa, my wife and assistant, entered the room. "Sorry, darling. I didn't know you were busy." She smiled sweetly. "Maybe bring an appetizer." Lisa nodded at the decanter of brandy. I looked questioningly at my guest. He smiled and shook his head negatively. "Thank you, dear. We'll be done soon." I did not introduce the guest to my wife. Lisa tilted her head, letting me know that she understood me, and quickly left the living room. "Where do you think this manor is located?" I returned to the conversation. "And what makes you think the collection still exists?" "I don't. I know. I was in Switzerland recently and saw a little girl's figure carved out of wood. It's from the Russian's collection. He was the only one who had figures like this. He showed me some in his St. Petersburg apartment. So you two know each other." I put the smoking cigar butt in the crystal ashtray. "Yes, casually. We crossed paths at an auction in Berlin. A year ago, he recognized me as a fellow countryman and invited me to visit his apartment in St. Petersburg. I took him up on that offer and stopped by. I fell in love with his collection. According to him, the main part of the collection is in his estate. It's about 100 kilometers along the Northwest Railroad. The manor is also called Elnik." The guest was rubbing his hands together with excitement. He asked the Russian if there were any hairs left or not. I took out a notebook. "I don't know. According to him, he had a sister. She was living in this estate at the time. According to the Russian, she's a little out of sorts, shuns people, and doesn't like to socialize with them. She is a recluse. She is most likely the primary heir. We need to find the manor, check if there is a collection there, and persuade the sister to sell it. You can set the price. I'll do anything." The man was even freezing in his chair from excitement. In front of me lay the ancient city of Casimir, dissolved in the haze, or rather, what was left of it. I walked north for almost half a day through this ancient land. High hills sometimes, and dense forest now breathed. We know. I stood at the top of the tower and looked out at the thick new thickets outlining the tower and the ruins of the ancient city. In the distance, almost at the very horizon, I could see multicolored strips of already compressed fields, rye and wheat, orphaned by the wide stream leisurely carrying its waters. I cautiously descended to the ground and walked on a road not traveled in a long time. The day was coming to an end, and the heat was slowly beginning to subside in the grass. The grasshoppers awoke, and soon the air was filled with their cheerful rolling. Behind me, I heard the squeak of wheels, and the whole not a horse. A cart surrounded by fresh hay was catching up with me. On the front sat a man overgrown, bearded to the ears, and lazily drove the horse to the oar, and carried a sledgehammer. "Is it something in a language I don't know?" he asked. I shrugged my shoulders, showing that I didn't understand anything. The man scratched his head, and after a bit of silence, said in pure Russian language, "Traveling Baron." "You can say so," I replied with interest, looking at the raven of local places, looking for the estate of Mr. Russian. "There is one. It's about 20 versts away. You won't get there by nightfall. You'll have to spend the night somewhere." The man looked at me strangely. "Are you a baptized cross-bearer yourself?" "Of course I'm baptized." I pulled out a silver cross on a leather lace from under my shirt. "That's good. These places aren't well-to-do. It's better not to go at night." The charioteer crossed himself with some unfamiliar sign of the cross. "Where can we sleep here?" I asked. "Is there an inn nearby, do you think?" "Just by Perrin's ferry crossing. The Armenians crossed the river during the party. It's not far from there." The man grinned. "Sit down, sir. What's the use of beating your legs for nothing?" He fucked Jamma, and the horse trotted off. We passed the ruins of the city, and the road looped between the hills again. We rode in silence. The charioteer knew what he wanted and silently smoked a duck and an assad. I leaned back on the soft, fragrant hay and dozed off to the sound of the wheels. I woke up when the wheels stopped beating. The cart stood in front of a wide rubrail of ship's pine from the battle. Here was the charioteer squirming. He smiled broadly and waved his hand as if inviting me in. I got off the carts and the lull of the legs, and with interest began to look at the unusual shapes of the house, more like an ancient terem. I looked back at the massive iron-striped gate under a high frame. Just in front of them stood an ancient copper cannon aimed at the steamer. Strange. For what purpose? Inside we were greeted by a white, red-cheeked, and full of piles hostess. Smelled of hot samovar and bread. "Who is it you've brought?" "Charles." She smiled with a full mouth, scrutinizing me with a supple look. "Yes, here is the Baron of the Russian Manor looking for him. He won't get there before dark, so accept a stay until morning." I inclined my head politely. "Come in, sir." The hostess's voice became viscously sweet, like overripe honey. I looked around. There were several tables in the hall. 3 men in the corner were drinking tea from a samovar with 3 pieces of sugar. Over the table hung a lively chatter in an unfamiliar language. They paid not the slightest attention to me. I sat down at a table covered with snow-white tablecloth, nodded to my traveling companion. "I invite you to join the company." My companion, while with pleasure, took off the con mascara and nestled it on a nail hammered into the wall, and went to the counter to order tea and snacks for the table. It was almost dark, and kerosene lamps were burning in the hall, creating a mysterious twilight, chipped with shadows. Above our table, too, the kerosene lamp was lit, shining in the shui with a flower as round as a large margarita of fire. Soon the hostess brought a tall white teapot and 2 coolly perky Seraphan cups. Next on the wheat table, somehow by magic, there was a stock and a decanter. While about something, I looked around the room. The walls of the hall, at first glance, seemed to me extensive oak panels. But then I saw that they were perfectly matched pine logs. They were waxed and had a special amber color. Judging by the quality of the woodwork, it had been done skillfully and lovingly for centuries. I imagined for a second how much time and effort such quality work took. Right in front of me on the wall hung several ancient wooden shields with iron booms and leather plates. Most of them were covered with red and black paint already rubbed off. Between the shields on the carpets hung large and small axes, swords, muzzles, ancient daggers, and outlandish knives. Oh, and God knows what else. The soft thief of carpets emphasized the elegance of forms and the hidden strength of fatigue. All this household, despite its antiquity, was well cleaned and oiled. What struck me as a lover of antiquities was the excellent cachet of all these rarities. It seemed that swords, axes, had only yesterday been plucked out by the smith of the armorers. On the adjoining wall hung several unusual musical instruments, some very similar to guitar, others of exotic appearance, not like violins or some kind of snags with strings and bounces. A couple of bear skins and a few antlers weighed in. All in all, it all gave the hall an old cozy look. I even felt like I was somewhere in the 9th century instead of the last 1915. While I was looking around the room, on the table, on the tray was already lying minced meat and even duck covered with forbidden apples, dumping night jam nearby on a variety of plates and spoons. Salted mushrooms by the gun with garlic, boiled potatoes, and pate were frolicking. Almost transparent slices of ham were served separately. Wild boar, well smoked and cross-cut. As soon as Charles was seated at my table, the hostess brought out a dispersed charcuterie on a tray, in a large pewter shot glass, splashing some creepy liquid with the aroma of mint and something unfamiliar. "Try it, Baron." Charles smiled. "You've never had this before." I followed him and put the shot glass in my mouth. The liquid burned my gut for a moment and was quickly confused by the elderly. Tears splashed from my eyes, but I restrained myself and did not blush. But as the hostess looked at me with curiosity, what is it only I could pronounce? translating the spirit brewed by an ancient recipe only for dear guests. The hostess nodded at the birch sap of 100 herbs, and the dishes kept arriving. On the table appeared clay, potted with pickled moose. Lips in under vinegar, my large wooden bowl of sauerkraut and pickles. Finally, the hostess personally placed a tin bowl on the table on which thinly sliced pieces of pie lay in a neat mound, made by mega-important cookie brains. Charles filled the cooling shot glasses with vodka and proclaimed a toast. To be good to the court and alive for good luck. I didn't understand everything in this toast, but I dutifully drank. We had a snack, and Charles took out a tape about a raven, twisted a gypsy, and bought from a lamp. Satisfied, let out a line of smoke. And what is it alive? As if, by the way, I asked. You'll soon see for yourself, Charles grinned. We had been sitting for more than an hour when an old wolfish man with no arms entered the hall. Having signed a little at the entrance, he took down from the wall an instrument remotely resembling a violin. Soon a loud melody floated through the hall. It was unlike anything I'd heard before. Ragged rips, notes, squeaks, clouds, a sound that penetrated all the way to the heart. The music seemed like aliens from another world, of a world where non-humans ruled the ball. The melody lashed across the floor, then went up under the roof, striving to break free. Finally, it succeeded, and it soared into the starry sky, straight to the golden chariot, the serpent, the god, the foot that began its flight into the coming dawn. The ancient music, played in these parts for 1,000 years, awakened vague and unfamiliar images in my mind that I had not suspected an hour ago. The hostess brought out a large wooden bowl and poured milk. The old man stopped playing and quietly tapped the floor with his staff. Knock, 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 knock. He stood for a while and knocked again. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of some movement from the dark corners of the plate. Snakes slowly crawled to the plate in unmanned shadows. I shuddered involuntarily. The very sight of creeping of warring creatures gave me a primal terror. I was about to rush to the exit, but he intercepted me by the arm. I froze and, afraid to move, stared at the tangle of snakes near the plate of milk. Suddenly, I felt something cold and slippery crawling up my leg. The head of a snake appeared above the table. It froze motionless as if taking in, occasionally showing its twin tongues, then crawled onto my lap and then onto the table. It grabbed from my plate a piece of meat and immediately swallowed. Now everyone in the room, or our table. The snake looked at me for some time with a non-running look, and then also leisurely descended to the floor on my leg and crawled to the plate. About 20 minutes passed, and the snakes slowly began to spread to the corners. People started talking in the hall again, and servants started running around. I sat in shock, unable to say a word. At last he managed to pour a shot of vodka into my mouth. He seemed to be frightened and surprised himself when we more or less came to our senses. My traveling companion said, "I have lived a long time, but this is the first time I have seen such a thing." Charles shook his head at the idea of the living embracing a man. Suddenly the old man, still standing at the entrance, looked in our direction. "To my head here alive. And to whom are they feet?" he said in a suddenly thick bass, tapped his staff, and walked out the door. What did he say? I looked at my neighbor. "The Serpentine was born tonight," the king said Charles fearfully, and looked at his mistress with a long, expressive look. It was already night outside the window. When I stood in the gate, there was a knocking in the courtyard. Well, knocked. That's a weak word. In the gate nails or something heavy, with Hilda's throat open loudly. Even from where I was standing, I could see the landlady turn pale and shudder. She nodded, and one of her servants ran to open the gate. A moment later, the stomping of horses' hooves sounded in the courtyard, and several men came in through the swinging doors, though it was not cold outside. They were dressed in cloaks made of wolf skins, wool on the outside. No weapons in sight, but long daggers were guessed under the squares. I knew that for local men a dagger is a mandatory attribute as a stone in the Caucasus. The newly arrived threw off their clothes and their arms under the running servants and sat down rankly at the free table on the benches. The hostess and the servants bustled around, arranging the utensils and dishes on the table. Soon the wine was sick in the parks, and the voices of the guests became louder. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the few visitors leaving the hall. Charles, too, disappeared as if vaporized. I, on the other hand, remained at my table. We ate the pie with pleasure and occasionally had a shot of vodka. Soon, I and later guests were left in the hall. The doors banged again, and a young lady entered the room. Her appearance was greeted with loud squawks. "Cindy, what's taking you so long?" They shouted for the hops and the young men. "Come and sit down with us." They quickly made room for their guest and moved her a wine glass. The maiden drained it in one fell swoop and looked curiously in my direction. I tried to ignore the merry company. I looked for my mistress with my eyes. "Going to go to bed?" "Pan, missus," sounded a melodious voice right above my ear. I looked up. Opposite my table stood a long-time maiden and smiled. "May I have a glass of wine with you?" She unceremoniously sat down on the bench. Across from me emerged from the darkness. The servant served her a full glass of red wine. I poured myself some vodka. The girl barely touched my shot glass with her glass and leisurely drained it to the bottom. I drank a little and put the shot glass on the table. "Pan is squeamish about drinking with me," quite loudly, unhappily said the maiden. He took me for a slutty girl. I already knew where this was going, and threw a quick glance at the opposite wall. Then I moved my valise toward me and opened it. My revolver was on the top of it, and it was a matter of seconds to get it out quickly. The room grew quiet. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement at a neighboring table and heard heavy footsteps. "Raven, that insolent, insulted me with a nasty voice," spelled the girl, hiding behind the broad back of her defender. "Pan knows what awaits him for insulting a lady." The scowling man spoke in a thick bass, putting his right hand on the hilt of his dagger. I involuntarily noticed the rings, thickly applied to his fingers. "Provincial ponce." I stand up. "Please forgive me if I have unwittingly offended you and yours. I've been here a long time, and I've had enough to drink. With your permission, I'm going to bed." I tried to speak peacefully, though I knew from experience that it would do little good in my situation. "Mr. Nobleman." The man spoke again. "No," I smirked. "That makes things easier. Now, I'll teach you how to talk to a lady. You're an asshole." Then he threw back the floor of his green lightweight captain's jacket and pulled out a whip from behind his girdle. I was still trying to dodge the contraction by appealing to the voice of reason, but in vain. The presence of an infantile Menka and Hop in my head were doing their job. Pans decided to make fun of a stranger, to dispel, so to speak, boredom. "Well done." He swung, going to hit me in the face with the whip, but I took a step to the side and shoved the offender with the palm of my hand. He couldn't stay on his feet and fell on his ass. The girl kicked out of the table and two men came up and rushed toward me. But I was already pulling a sword with a ravenous, narrow blade from the wall. I didn't dance or make glamorous paw with my sword. I just rushed in front of the two men who were running towards me and struck one of them in the face with the blade. He stumbled and fell to the floor. I met the other with a blow of my right hand, holding the hilt, and I could hear the bones of his nose cracking. On my left, a small man with a weighty club in his hand rushed at me. I didn't like to start with him, lunged and punctured his arm. He howled and was no longer interested in me. Meanwhile, the maiden who had been lying continuously all this time helped the first one out of the door. That one snatched up a long dagger and, putting forward his right hand, rushed at me. I was busy with the servant and missed the moment. "Look out!" my mistress shouted to me, and I had time to turn around with a swift swing of my sword. The dagger fell from my assailant's hand, and then I was out of the way. A right straight punch to the jaw knocked the guy to the ground. I kicked him a few times, trying with the toe of my boot to mess up his face. If on the Grandees Pawnee no longer ran, she sat silently, hammered in a corner, and watched the bloody fight with fear. Finally, the brawlers calmed down. 3 bodies lay motionless on the floor. The very first one was slightly underfoot. A servant sat by the column, clasping his bleeding hand with his hand. I stood motionless, holding the hilt of the sword in my palm. The light of the oil lamp reflected on its tip, gleaming predatorily. For a second, it seemed to me that death itself was dancing on my knee. Unforgiving and ruthless on the battlefield remained behind me. Thank you, Monsieur Lefort, for the lesson. Old Norman wrestling. That was very helpful. Not for nothing did I devote so much time to it at the Junkers School. Good blade, I said respectfully, and wiped the blade. And the white shirt to the servant then returned the weapon to its place. I turned to the hostess. She understood me without words and herself filled my glass with elm. I tipped the scalding drink into my mouth and picked up my valise. Carefully, I stepped over the pans that had fallen silent on the floor. Show me to my room. I turned to the landlady. She took the kerosene, a new lamp, and without saying anything went to the stairs leading to the second floor. The day began, as usual, with an all-consuming boredom. Putting on a robe after a nap, Lisa had a cup of coffee in the dining room. At that time, the clock struck 12. It was time to get ready for lunch. Lisa yawned, and with a bronze knife began to cut up the fancy French magazine delivered the night before. But no sooner had she cut the first page than the doorbell rang. A minute later, she was told that her brother Christopher and his companion had arrived. Without knowing why, Lisa was delighted at her brother's unexpected visit, especially with a mate after marrying Stephen. Brother and sister did not see each other often. Christopher avoided her husband in every way possible, considering it beneath his dignity to consort with some old box, especially since Stephen was not a nobleman and was clearly not fit for husband's Bukvayazemskaya. After the wedding, Lisa moved with her husband to the capital in his apartment. She felt that Stephen loved her. He pampered her in every possible way, bought expensive jewelry, dressed in the latest fashion, took her to theaters and galleries. Everything was fine at first sight, but it was only at first sight. Lisa caught on herself sympathetic, contemptuous looks of others. How could she, a born princess, sacrifice her nobility and title for the sake of her husband? Raznochency, former serf. Not that it hurt her much, but still one had to admit it was unpleasant. And most of all, boredom. She didn't know what to do. She was going to study, but then she changed her mind. Lisa was educated. Her background gave her certain advantages. She had even graduated from the Smolny Institute, but it was difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to find a use for her talents in the empire. True, there was a way to give birth to Stephen children and take care of them. But something kept Lisa from taking that step, as if she were not quite finished. Surely she and Stephen would live together until they were old. Stephen had been gone for almost a week now, and Lisa did not know when her husband would return. She looked longingly at her watch and sighed heavily. Just then Christopher entered the living room. He was accompanied by a dapper young man dressed in a gray tee with a mustache. He was of the type that ladies like so much. Lisa noticed this at once and smiled to herself. "Hello, my soul." Christopher kissed his sister on the cheek. "Let me introduce you to my old friend Sebastian. He returned from London yesterday and is full of impressions. Sebastian, this is my sister Lisa." Christopher tilted his head. Sebastian took Lisa's outstretched palm with cold fingers and touched it lightly with his lips. "Where's your miser, grandmother?" "All with the old man." Christopher's voice was full of contempt. "Christopher, please." Lisa looked at her brother reproachfully. "Stephen has been away on business for a week." "That's fine. Sebastian invites us to the Mikhailovsky Theater. The French are doing Traviata tonight. But then to the Metropole restaurant. Sophia is singing there tonight with a gypsy corps. It's wonderful. It's so good. And then there will be some exotic dances only for our own people." The maid came in and began to set out the coffee utensils, but the guests categorically refused coffee, citing urgent business. Christopher promised to pick up the visa at 18 o'clock. That was the end of it. Lisa finally unfolded the magazine, but she couldn't read it. Sebastian's face loomed before her eyes. Lisa chased away the thought, inappropriate for a married woman. But she couldn't help herself. She knew one thing for sure. She liked Sebastian. The upcoming evening made her dizzy, and Lisa hummed to herself and began to try on her evening gown. The opera was wonderful. As always, was at the top of her game. The audience applauded for a long time and did not want to let her go after the performance. Lisa and her companions got into their own Sebastian carriage and went to the Metropole. By the time they arrived, the restaurant was full, but Sebastian had booked a table in advance. After a while, their company was joined by herself. She kissed Christopher playfully, gave Sebastian a friendly nod, and smiled at Lisa. Everything that was happening made her dizzy. It was a charming evening, and Sebastian seemed like a true English gentleman. "You have a very delicate nature," he whispered in Lisa's ear as he refilled her glass of red wine. Lisa was pleased by the young man's attention. She nodded and smiled at the corner of her lips. "Do you have such an expressive face, like in old Italian paintings?" The intrusive bow didn't stop. "Any artist would be happy to paint your portrait. Just a face." Unexpectedly, with coquettish Lisa, Sebastian was embarrassed for a moment, then began complimenting her with even more fervor. The gypsies sang and danced, and a young lady in bow came on stage. They held hands and froze in anticipation of the music. A guitar played and the dance began. The music was unusual, but extremely passionate. So was the dance. The partners moved quickly on the stage in a single impulse. It seemed that love and passion were about to engulf them both. The guitar played louder. It was joined by another music, then hushed, then played loudly. Finally, the partner surrendered and threw herself on her beau's arm. The hall exploded with applause. "What is the name of this dance?" Lisa asked with a gasp. "Tango." Sebastian replied condescendingly. "Soon it will conquer the whole of Europe." By the end of the evening, Lisa was already quite tipsy, and when Sebastian offered to see his collection of bronzes brought from England, she unexpectedly agreed. She was back in her familiar environment. She revolved among the nobility and bohemians, and therefore saw nothing criminal in going to see the collection of statuettes of a young man hitherto unknown to her, especially when accompanied by her brother and his companion. Sebastian lived in a spacious apartment in Schmidt's house, almost in the very center of St. Petersburg. They all sat for a while longer, drinking a bottle of old French wine. Then, after coffee, Christopher discreetly disappeared with his girlfriend into one of the rooms. The wine was drunk, and the atmosphere cozy. Pushed to madness, Lisa never fully realized how she had ended up in Sebastian's bed, staring intently into his eyes. She gave herself without foreplay, and only when she felt him inside her. She remembered Stephen, but after a few sweet moments, she forgot again. Responding to his caresses, she sensed that Sebastian had a lot of experience with women. When he entered, she felt a hot warmth spill over her body. She felt so good with him that she soon. Lisa wanted nothing more. She wanted it to continue indefinitely. In the morning, remorse came over her. With her mind, she realized that she had cynically betrayed her husband that night. But she felt so good that she didn't want to leave her new acquaintance. Then Christopher appeared with his mistress, and they had fun again, forgetting everything. Several times Lisa caught a rather smirking grin from her brother. Lisa did not return home until the next day, consumed by passion. She had not even considered that Stephen might have returned. After a few years of quiet, measured life with her husband, Lisa felt happy and so desirable. She felt no particular remorse. "I just didn't know what to do next, whether to end the relationship with Sebastian immediately or, on the contrary, to continue it." She did not consider the time spent in her lover's bed to be cheating. Lisa was not going to leave her husband. Well, regretted a little, not washed off. She continued to love Stephen, and even wanted to have children with him. Or she did. but not with him. She was quite satisfied with a secure life with her husband, his calm, non-fanatical love. But Sebastian's heart was sweetly flooded and butterflies fluttered in her stomach. Sebastian, before going to bed, he would walk around the room completely naked for a while, giving Lissa the opportunity to admire his body, completely confident in its beauty. And then it was back to kissing, thrusting, and she would dive headfirst into the hot waves of pleasure. I woke up to a quiet knock at the door. "Get up," Baron heard the soft voice of the landlady. I jumped out of bed, noting the valise next to the bed. I opened it with a jerk and made sure that the revolver was still there. I dressed quickly and went downstairs to the hall. There were no traces of last night's battle. The floor was cleanly washed. There was breakfast on the corner table. I ate quickly and paid. I thought for a while and put a nickel on top. "For your trouble." When I kissed the hospitable hostess's hand and headed for the door, she called out to me, "Mr. Marlowe, do I have a present for you?" She picked up a cane standing in the corner and held it out to me. "It will be easier for you with it." I took a separate bronze-weighted stick and hung it on my arm. The hostess looked at me with a grin. Suddenly, I understood everything. With my hand, I touched the handle in the shape of Razimu Snake's mouth and turned it gently. In a moment, a rather wide blade appeared in my hand, gleamed predatorily. In the light of the sunbeam, it was brought by my late husband, but he did not have time to use it. Tears glistened in the eyes of my hostess. "Have a safe journey. Take care. I'll pray for you." She kissed me on the cheek and baptized me with the sign of the cross. Charles was waiting for me in the yard, sitting on the front of the cart. He looked as if nothing had happened, smiled welcomingly at me smoking his duck. "It's time to go. Baron, we'll be there by lunchtime." Gray-haired Charles picked up the reins. I put my valise on the cart. The cart was lined with fresh hay, covered with a cloth-colored blanket. While I was getting settled, did the man make a face at the squeak? The wagon moved off. It was not so hot today. Soon the road slid into the woods, and it was even a little cooler. The fluffy business boughs formed a kind of pollock over the forest inn. The sun's rays hardly broke through the thick needles, and soon dusk enveloped the whole place. At one point, it seemed to me that once the train all the way to the ground spruce trees were about to close around us forever, shutting out the sun in my soul, slowly began to rise unrecognized, sitting in the very depths of consciousness, primal fear of the forest. I even cocked my head a few times, as if I wanted to ward it off. This obsession. Charles from the mountains, who had killed, sat on the front of the cart, and from time to time, as if reluctantly, drove the reins of the sadly coming horse. I lay down on the summer-smelling hay, putting my valise under my head, and watched the decayed and spruce trees slowly floating by. The cart bounced sharply. It hit a bump. The forest road narrowed noticeably. The paws of spruce trees were already clinging to the sides of the cart. Like the hands of ghouls, Charles smoked his stinking duck unperturbed. "This place is a death trap. All sorts of creatures." Suddenly he spoke. I looked around involuntarily. If there was a forest undead here before, it hasn't gone anywhere. So it lives among timid swamps and in thick, impenetrable roads. "There's a lot to see here." As if reading my thoughts, Charles said, "Don't take off your cross." I involuntarily fumbled for the silver cross hanging on a chain under my clothes. The cart ran on buds and roots protruding from the ground. Finally, we came to the edge of a rather large clearing. At its edge stood a large one-story wooden house surrounded by a metal fence. It had now slipped and fallen down in places. It was obvious that the estate was missing its owner's hand. There was a smell of smoke mixed with the odor of water. Well, here we are. This is the Russian's estate. It's not a nice place. Nothing but swamps. Charles crossed himself. "Goodbye, Baron. Maybe I'll see you again sometime." I took out some money to pay the freedman, but Charles shook his head negatively. He quickly turned the wagon around in the cart, bouncing on kidneys, disappeared into the woods. A moment later, the pitiful neighing of a horse reached me. The next morning, Sebastian sent Lisa a huge bouquet of red roses, and she couldn't resist. She spent the night in his arms again. The vicious liaison was addictive. Lisa spent almost all her evenings with her lover, almost always staying overnight. At some point, she realized it wasn't love. Lisa was sure she would not trade her husband for a lover. Every time she got into the carriage sent for her, Lisa convinced herself that it was the last time. But she couldn't help herself. So she went to see her lover again and again. What could you possibly have in common with this junk in your cheeks, kissing a young woman? Sebastian asked. This is a man not of our circle. Living with him will defame you and your family. Don't forget, you are a born princess by Izumskaya. Stay with me, and I'll throw the whole world at your feet. You'll be what you should be again. Passion surrounded the head of Lise. I didn't feel like talking. She only pressed her lover's head more tightly to her breast, giving her whole body and soul to his caresses. A week passed from Stephen. There had been no news. Despite the adventures of love, Lisa's heart was troubled, and Sebastian was becoming more and more insistent. He was already jealous of her husband, and Christopher was adding fuel to the fire. What do you want? It's a good match. A rich, intelligent nobleman. Give up your miser, saber, and take your place in society again. He persisted in persuading his sister. Take his money and move in with Sebastian. But it's indecent. Stephen is my husband. Lisa weakly resisted, realizing with her mind that there was a rational grain in her brother's proposal, especially since Sebastian is so sweet. But when her lover presented Lisa with a gold and diamond necklace, she trembled with her brother's help. Lisa opened the safe in her husband's office, took all the cash and bank bearer bonds. With almost 5,000, she packed up her belongings and moved in with Sebastian. Not a week had passed since Stephen's departure. Meanwhile, taking my valise in my left hand and keeping my cane in my right, I made my way toward the miraculously surviving drama. As I approached, looking more closely at the bar house, the ordinary large house gradually over the decades took on the features of a typical mansion typical of the northwestern region. One story with a roof island and attic with boarded-up windows. A handsome, carved, oak door and leather iron lanterns hung on either side of the front entrance above the entrance itself, painted portico supported by 4 antique-style columns, which gave the house itself a certain playfulness and frivolity. But despite the mix of architectural styles, the house inspired an unmotivated fear. Its seemingly frivolous architectural excesses not only did not soften this impression, but instead gave the house an inexplicable gloominess and mystery. I was unfamiliar with this architectural style peculiar to these gloomy, swampy woods. Behind the house stretched a dense business forest stretching for many kilometers. The front was closely adjoined by an old neglected park, in which once well-kept fruit trees protruded from yellowed weeds, spreading their branches like Black Oscar's evil hands. The facade of the mansion. There was that painted in yellow-green color, the light of bureaucratic boredom, and about that vividly creepy. However, from painting little remained, as the plaster mostly fell off. Survived triangular gables and above the windows, whose Renaissance austerity has been softened, and the plaster wigs are tall. The narrow 3 or 4 windows reminded me of the end of history and the former greatness of the owners, leaning lightly on a cane. I approached the front doors at the entrance. Suddenly, a sense of inexplicable danger made me look back. Right behind my back, about 3 meters away, pinning his ears and menacingly here motionless, froze a huge gray wolf. He didn't make a sound, only not dog-like lower his fluffy tail to his hind legs. His fierce, non-running gaze on his bloodshot eyes held me as if in its crosshairs. Who is it? An unexpected voice in the silence brought me out of my daze. Trying not to make any sudden movements, I slowly turned around. On the stone porch stood a gray-haired old man, clutching a long antique shotgun pointed at me. It was clear that it was loaded, as there was a smoking wick in his left hand, which he held down with his thumb. He had a rather brave appearance, a tanned, wrinkled face. On his head, on a genuine white wig, thin, taut in the room, tied with a wide belt, similar to Slutskys on legs spread apart, soft, brown boots with busy upward noses. Grandfather, in spite of his tender age, held a rifle, very confidently ready to fire at any moment from such a distance it was impossible to miss. I set the valise down carefully and held up my hands. "Don't shoot. I am from Street Petersburg. I have business with your mistress." I tried to speak smoothly, so as not to frighten the old soldier. The old man was silent, apparently trying to decide what to do. I smiled. "My name is Stephen Marlowe. Report me to Mrs. Russian." My voice was sweeter than honey. "There is no Mistress Ruska Jadwiga here. The mistress of this manor." "Importantly," said the old man in Russian, "her brother." I was relieved. It seemed I had come to the right place. Now it was very important to meet with the mistress and learn from her about the fate of the collection. The old man grabbed his gun and disappeared out the door. I turned my head. The wolf was still standing behind my back, keeping his yellow eyes on me. Finally, the door opened again and the same old man appeared on the porch, but this time without a gun. "Pani Jadwiga asked you to come through." The old man opened the door, letting me into the house. Elegantly bowing my head and crossing the threshold, I looked back. The wolf was gone. I looked up, head and looked up at the piercing blue sky with white clouds, and the blue sun hangs in the sky for a long time, as if it doesn't want to give up its rights to the night. But then, as if realizing, it instantly disappears and darkness falls on the earth. I climbed up to the voyage and stepped inside the house, the musty air of old age and decay. It hit me in the face. I looked around. A spacious hallway of its own size, more like a dance hall. A wooden staircase leading up to the attics. In the right corner of the hall, a large fireplace made of wild stone, which was brought to these places 1,000 years ago by a glacier. It was obvious that the fire had recently been lit on the walls of the temples with ancient paintings by long-forgotten artists, mixed with hunting trophies. The horns of skull heads of animals, hunted at different times, were placed on special medallions covered with black lacquer. From time, the lacquer in some places was drawn and crumbled, which gave the interior some sinister part. From the ceiling on chains, from the paddle, a huge bronze chandelier with lice, a gorocomb of candles, like the fireplace. It too had been recently lit. A bit of furniture, worn, upholstered, and an ebony table completed the interior. From the hall to the depths of the house led several doors, and I stopped in indecision. What can I do for the gentleman? An elderly lady, accompanied by a young maiden, came out to meet me. "Allow me to introduce myself. Marlowe Stephen the antiquary." I bowed my head. "I have business with you. We could talk in private." I did not want to start a serious conversation on the fly in the presence of a stranger, especially since I recognized in the girl the very drunkenness for which I got into a fight with the local Don Juan. Judging by the sparkling eyes, the girl also recognized me, but she tried not to show it. "I have no secrets from my niece." The lady threw her head down angrily. "Cindy, make us some coffee. Let's go into the living room." The hostess made an inviting gesture and headed for one of the doors. We were seated in the large room at a round table. Cindy brought a tray from the coffee pot and cups and poured the coffee. I took a sip out of politeness and marveled. The coffee was very good. "So what business do you have with me?" The hostess said dryly and looked me in the eye. I outlined the essence of the matter, telling about a favorable deal on the sale of the collection. I was ready to pay the money right now in gold or assignats. I was trying to say something else when the landlady stopped me. "My brother spent his life wandering the world, collecting his vile collection. God punished him for it by giving him a disease that killed him. He left behind Cindy, his daughter. Who the mother is, I don't know. That's another of his sins." I looked at the Japanese woman. She had her head down, and was not at all like the unleashed maiden I had seen in the cards. "I have burned this lewd gathering so that it will not tempt anyone," continued the hostess. "That will be all, Mr. Marlowe." I think the matter is over. It's too late to spend the night at the manor. Tomorrow Jack will take you to the nearest whiskey." She got up and left without saying goodbye, followed by Cindy. After a quick glance at me, Jack, who acted as a watchman and footman, led me into a room that had apparently been a study. A desk, an armchair, a sofa against the wall, and a fireplace. Above the sofa was a portrait of a beautiful young woman in a dress with letters. I did not want to go to bed and decided to spend the night on the sofa. I put my valise at the headboard, put my revolver under the pillow, and placed my cane next to it. God protects the wiser. I was already asleep when there was a knock at the door. Jack brought supper. A long tablecloth, white on starch, was tentatively set on the table. As if by magic, even bowls of sauerkraut, pickles, and pickled breasts appeared, separated by a footman. A bowl of raw eggs on a small plate lay neatly on a reasonable lard with a solid meat layer. Finally, a hot cast iron with stew, potatoes, and a wonderful one appeared on the table. Jack went out and quickly returned with a Countess Wild cold vodka. Here now the still life could be considered finished while I ate. It was already getting dark. The sun was hidden behind a reasonable fence from the tops of fir trees immediately pulled cold. Autumn was inexorably taking its toll. Jack. He melted the fireplace and said good night to me. Having settled down on the sofa, I drank vodka. Pleasant warmth began to develop slowly. Moonlight penetrated into the room through the long-ago unwashed window, leaving a light path on the floor and wall. I closed my eyes. The events of the past day raced through my head, keeping me awake. I lay blissfully awake. All over my body was paying out, sweet from home. For the first time in ages, I felt calm and peaceful. I glanced at my watch in the not-too-bright glow of the eternal flame. The hand showed 22 o'clock, early by city standards. But here in the forest wilderness, it was late night. Life surrounded by wild, untouched nature seemed to me clear and simple. One should get up at dawn, go hunting, fishing for mushrooms, have dinner in the evening, and go to bed early. Forest swamps, gun, fire, lack of stress, and a healthy lifestyle contribute to longevity. I envy the people who live here. I'd give up everything to live here in the middle of nowhere and live out my life in peace and quiet. I thought, falling asleep. I didn't understand why I woke up. I lay there for a few minutes, pondered where I then opened my eyes. The candle was burning and went out, but the room was quite bright from the color of the full moon streaming through the window. Suddenly, a distinctive sound came from the hallway, slamming the door. I sat up and took the revolver in my hand. What is it? Without putting on my boots, I went to the door and listened. Someone was walking slowly down the hall. Could it be Jack going around the house? Acting as watchman or landlady, unable to sleep, snapped loudly, and the sound of footsteps came closer and closer. I opened the door slightly. I could clearly see a part of the corridor, dedicated by moonlight. Well could be heard. Footsteps clinked together, but I couldn't see anyone. I began to feel uneasy. It was damned funny. From outside, the faint but distinct barking of a dog reached me. I went back to the window and looked down, but I couldn't see anyone, no matter how hard I tried. As soon as I heard that barking, goosebumps ran down my spine. Even now, years later, it's hard for me to say why I reacted the way I did to an ordinary dog barking. But back then, in the house, I only gripped the grip of my revolver tighter. I listened. The footsteps died away, and I suddenly realized that there was someone or something at the door. And somehow I was sure that something terrible was waiting for me. Trying to make as little noise as possible, I slowly cocked the trigger with my thumb, cautiously approached the door, and then swung it open. Meanwhile, life together with Sebastian Lisa seemed like paradise at first. She bathed in his love, paying little attention to what was going on around the money, actually stolen from her husband. She gave it to Christopher for safekeeping. He lucidly explained to Lisa that it would be more secure with him. But after a while, Lisa began to feel a guilty conscience. She was worried that she had been so mean to Stephen, abandoning and robbing her own husband. It wasn't easy to get it out of her head. She tried to forget herself in unrestrained merriment, but the black thoughts came back to her and kept her awake, especially at night. Sebastian and Christopher told Lisa about the bright prospects of the near future. Sebastian suggested going to the church court and asking for permission to hear, but Lisa realized that her chances of becoming a free woman were very slim. True, there was one catch. If she could accuse her husband of adultery, even the church court could rule favorably on her case. When she had spoken to Sebastian about it, he had grasped at that straw with enthusiasm. It was only a matter of finding bribed witnesses and filing for divorce. At the same time, Lisa and her brother decided to petition the emperor for the return of Lisa, title, and nobility. Her husband had taken advantage of her family's plight and almost forcibly married her. Here, too, there was hope that all would turn out well. In the meantime, Lisa and her friends continued to spend Stephen's money without denying themselves anything. But no matter how much Lisa tried to forget herself, she waited with fear for her husband's return, realizing that under the law of the empire, he had every right to forcibly bring her home. One evening, as she and Sebastian drank a bottle of Chateau Renault, Lisa asked her lover what they would do if the courts didn't work out. Sebastian thought for a moment, then said, "I have good connections with the social revolutionaries. They're quiet now, but I can make arrangements with the right people, and your Stephen will be gone in one fell swoop." Lisa shuddered at these words, but her status as a widow promised her tantalizing prospects. Giving her access to Stephen's main money, she wiped away her tears and smiled blissfully. Meanwhile, I cautiously approached the door and then swung it open sharply. No one was there. I only felt a slight breeze blowing in. Without letting go of my weapon, I stepped out into the hallway and made my way down the hall. All was quiet. There was something lying on the bottom step of the stairs leading to the attic. I bent down and gingerly picked up a small object, a small spearhead made of white metal, most likely silver. It had a leather lanyard on it. It was an amulet. Apparently, it had once adorned the chest of a warrior. The amulet was made in the Oriental style and decorated with intricate ornaments. Did someone drop it or plant it on purpose? I took it in my hand. How could it not be here? I decided to appropriate it. Putting the amulet in my pants pocket, I went back into the room, closed the door at the ankle, and laid down on the couch again. After a while, sleep watched me. I woke up to a chilling, howling human scream. Yes, carrying everything from the street. A gunshot rang out. I rushed down the stairs, shoving my feet into my boots as I went. Hardly had I run out of the house when a flock of bats flew over my head, flapping their wings loudly. I turned my head and saw a vague shadow flicker in the distance. A group of hastily dressed people were crowding about 50 meters away from the house. As I got closer, I saw the body of a confused man lying on the ground. He was already dying. His voice was weakened. He kept mumbling something in an unknown language. Then he stretched out and froze forever, turning into a heap of ugly flesh on the soft earth around him and wiping the body anew. The footprints of some giant animal were clearly visible. 2 men covered the body with leather and dragged it onto a stretcher. The mistress standing nearby wrapped a woolen shawl around the body, then said something quietly to Jack, who held the billet, the gun, and slowly walked toward the house. No one paid the slightest attention to me. The people around me seemed to understand perfectly well what the matter was, and to them there was nothing unusual about it. I put my revolver behind my belt and walked to the door of the study. I had a feeling that there was someone inside. I cautiously opened the door and saw a female figure on the sofa, illuminated by the bright moonlight. Hearing the door creak open, the woman turned around. God, I even flinched. It was Cindy. Illuminated by the moonlight, beautiful face, the same white dress. The girl walked up to me without saying a word. She took my hand and led me to the couch. From surprise, I lost the ability to resist. I woke up from a hot, long kiss. I carefully moved away from the young body. I'm sorry, I can't. I have a wife. I mumbled a little audibly. She's not here. I want you. She covered my face with kisses, trying to pull my jacket off my shoulders. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a prude or a slacker. I've had women in my life, young and not so young, but I've been married. And most importantly, I love my wife. I couldn't go back on the vows I made at the altar. To be together for better or for worse, to die on the same day. I'm sorry, Cindy. I can't. You're very beautiful, but I'm not free. I said something else, trying not to offend the girl by saying no. Finally, she quieted down and just sat there, pressed against me. Are you looking for a collection or something? Suddenly she asked, fixing her bangs. Pani Jadwiga burned it, but a small part of it survived. I'll show you. She was silent for a moment, as if hesitating to tell me something. I'll show you where it's hidden, but you'll take me away from here, she said firmly. Where from the surprise? I asked a stupid question. I don't care where. As long as it's away from here, I can't stay here any longer. The lady grabbed me from Mr. Corbin. He's in his 70s. He's already paid for me in gold. Cindy suddenly sobbed. I'd rather drown myself. What's life like that? She's your aunt. I shuddered at her sobs. She's not my aunt. I'm her brother's adopted daughter. He took me from the orphanage 6 years ago, kept me here until he died. Now my aunt wants to make a profit off me. Cindy grabbed my hand. Take me out of here. I'm gonna be lost anyway. She fixed her bangs again with that familiar motion. I'd seen it before, but I couldn't remember anyone who'd ever done it. In fact, Cindy reminded me of someone. But who? I looked at the beautiful face. I stroked the silks, the clean hair. It gave off an odor, the faint scent of drunken jasmine. It was as if I could read her mind. Take me away, my love. Don't leave me, she whispered. I've waited so long for you, love and moons. The scent of jasmine. The girl lit the lantern and stood up. Come, I'll show you the collection. I stood in a damp cellar, and before me on a hastily made fairy tale of rotten floorboards, on a pedestal stood a coffin covered with mold and bits of clay. It was evident that it had long rested in the cemetery soil. Once made of oak planks, it was now a pitiful sight. The lid was pulled off, and well-preserved human remains came into view. In some places the bones were shattered, but on the whole the skeleton was well preserved, the skull with long hair, fangs, and empty eye sockets. Next to the skeleton lay a sword, but even without this attribute it was clear to me that it was a warrior. But that's not what struck me. On the chest of your corpse on a leather lanyard hung an amulet, exactly like the one I found on the stairs 2 hours earlier. I don't know why, but I was suddenly overcome with terror. I lost the ability to think and move. A creature with brightly glowing eyes was approaching me. It came so close that I could hear its angry breathing. Suddenly it grabbed me with its paws and teeth, batted at my neck. I felt the pain of the bite, and a warm trickle of blood ran down my chest. I snapped out of my fake nightmare. The sun was shining outside the window. On the table was a white towel-covered breakfast of toasted slices of white bread, butter, and a pot of hot coffee. Honestly, I didn't yet realize where was dream and where was reality. I remembered well how the jar and I had gone down to the basement, how she had shown me the straw-covered boxes that held the cloth-wrapped wooden figures. Even at first glance, they were worth a fabulous amount of money. Then Cindy left, and I fell into this nightmare. I even leaned in. It was so natural. Well, it was time to leave. Just how to get the collection and the pit. The door shrieked and Jack came in. Good morning, Baron, he said respectfully. Cindy has told me everything. Help her, Baron. She's a good girl. She doesn't belong here. Jack wished with his lips and continued. The wagon is ready for you. I've put the boxes of dolls in there and covered them with hay. Cindy will be waiting for us at the fork behind the old cemetery. It's not far from here. Mrs. Jadwiga has gone to Kuma's and won't be back until tonight. I'll take you straight to the station. Hurry up, Baron. In the meantime, I don't think there'll be any trouble." Sebastian took a sip of wine, clearly savoring the drink. "How soon we solve our case?" Sebastian looked at Lisa. "What's the holdup?" "As soon as the object appears in the city, we do it right away. Don't worry, everything will be honorable and noble. The mosquito won't poke its nose in." The man sitting opposite Sebastian looked expressively at the empty bottle of Take Down the Satrap. "That's the only way to do it." Sebastian wrinkled his nose. "Is he drunk or what?" He nodded to the sex man. "Some kind of inadequate." But he didn't say anything out loud. The interlocutor was drinking a second bottle. After all, he was pestering about revolution and terror. They were starting to pay attention. Sebastian put the envelope with the money under the tablecloth and bowed out. "I'm waiting for the result on the street." Lisa cried. She suddenly felt sorry for her husband. But then she remembered the money and Sebastian, and the sadness receded. Ah, if only it could be done without killing. Sebastian jumped into the span and cradled his mistress's left body. Lisa sighed and kissed his cheek. "I love you so much, sweetheart." An hour later, we pulled up to the old cemetery, pulling in on both sides of the road. Judging by the general desolation, the gnarled monuments and broken hailstones, no one had been buried in the cemetery for a long time. There was silence all around. Not even the sound of the wind could be heard. The place was definitely haunted. I wandered at night between the mossy gravestones with inscriptions in an unknown language, which no one could read. I even got a little creepy. But I realized it wasn't ghosts I had to fear, it was living people. "Come on, Cindy. You picked a good place to meet." Jack looked at me with a frown, as if he'd read my mind in that abandoned January cemetery. There are such people in this land, and no one can read the inscriptions, not even the Braves. The inscriptions are badly erased. I marveled at the knowledge of the village man. I'd heard something about them. They fought a long battle with the Slavs who came to this land from the west. The wars lasted for 100 years until these people assimilated with the invaders, but they preserved their language and their culture to this day. At the edge of the cemetery, Cindy was waiting for us, dressed in high-lifted traveling gowns. Seeing our carriage, she deftly jumped on it and smiled dreamily. Her thoughts were already in Street Petersburg. I did not share her optimism, if only because horsemen appeared from the turn. When they saw us, they quickly headed in our direction. It was immediately clear to me that we would not be able to escape. 4 armed guards of the county police, led by an associate. "Wait, who are they?" shouted the eldest, holding his horse. "People from out of town. We're going to the station." Did I answer as politely as possible? "We have documents." The ranger kept a suspicious look on my face. "Kuzmik, look, there's a girl." A young voice sounded behind me. I turned around. One of the guards had pulled Cindy's handkerchief off, and her blonde hair fell over her shoulders. "She's all right," the young one laughed. "Give me the papers." The guard leaned toward me and held out his hand. At that moment, there was an indignant shout from Cindy. The guard got off his horse and shamelessly searched for the girl to the loud laughter of his associates. "I thought you were the police, but you're a gang of guards." Disappointedly stretched out I. "Are you literate?" The town officer swung to hit me with a whip, but did not have time. The revolver struck the shot. The policeman dropped the whip and grabbed his arm. I ran up to him and pulled him off his horse, put the revolver to his temple. "Come on, hurry up," I shouted to his troops. Guns on the ground. Fearfully sticking their Glizzen Abbas at me, the soldiers slowly got off their horses. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. I shot into the air. The horses bucked fearfully and rushed down the road. "You're finished," came the voice of the older man. "He'll rot at the penal colony." I did not deny myself the pleasure of striking him in the teeth with the handle of my revolver. Now he was busy, spitting out splinters of teeth with Jack's blood. "Gather the guns in the cart." I commanded the valet. And don't shake. You'll be all right. While Jack panted, Cindy hopped off the wagon, quickly picked up the rifles that had been thrown on the road, then stood there as if thinking about something and quickly kicked the young guard in the butt with the toe of her boot. He screamed and bent almost to the ground. Apparently, he was collecting eggs on the road. The officer, clamping his bloody mouth, found it necessary to keep silent. Now let's get out of here. I jumped into the cart and nodded to Jack. Pull the cart. Cheerfully jammed, body over the potholes, leaving behind defeated troops of the land police. Evenings. Soon the station was to appear. We drove through the forest and into a less well-maintained inn. The sound of hoof stomping reached my ear. A gendarme cavalry troop came out of the forest. Yes, these are not the Zemstvo police. They do it without blinking an eye, I thought. And that's a lot of military men today. Skokov in front of the detachment. The staff captain raised his hand. The horsemen surrounded us. Who are they? The commander spoke calmly, feeling behind him strength. We were on a visit. We're going to the station now. I spoke calmly too. The officer looked at his watch and suddenly said it's 2:00 before the train. So you'll make it in time. Marlowe, I looked carefully at the staff captain. Holy shit, it's Joe. Our bunks were next to each other at the junior college. This is the meeting. Joe jumped off his horse and came up to me. Well, hello devils. We hugged. Can I have a word with you? I touched my classmate's sleeve. We stepped aside, whispered a little. Then Lieutenant Redchinsky himself gave the order. Take the men and go back. There are policemen somewhere on the road. Pick them up and take their weapons from the cart. Smith and Joseph stay with me. We'll escort Mr. Marlowe to the station. The train arrived at Street Petersburg. Early in the morning, I hired a coachman and a loader. They moved the crates of dolls to the cart. Cindy and I got into the aisle and drove to my house. I decided not to keep anything from Lisa, knowing her kind nature. She must be sympathetic to the poor girl's plight. When I entered the apartment, my favorite wife did not meet me in the kitchen. Only the maid Wendy came up to meet me. She confusedly told me that Lisa had gone away a week ago with some young man and his brother. Well, I knew her brother. He was forgiving. 2 meetings were enough for me to turn him down. But who was the other one? From what the maid told me, Lisa ran away with my money. Not a great loss, but I left Cindy in Wendy's care. I sat down on the couch and thought about what to do next. I'd only been gone a little over a week. I'd already lost my wife and my money. Ugh, money. To hell with the wife. Here's the rub. What could have happened in such a short time that she had ruthlessly stepped over my love? For me, there was no alternative. Kick her to the curb. But still, what influenced her? Was it princely hubris or an unsatisfied vanity? I took out a bottle of cognac and poured myself a full shot. How is it our way? Drown your sorrows in cognac. But I didn't have time to drink it. There was a loud knock at the door. In a minute, Wendy brought into my office a young military-looking officer in a blue uniform, handed me a sealed Surguta packet. While I read, the sub-lieutenant stood silently and looked at me faithfully. Everything is clear. I folded the paper. Mr. Captain, the carriage is waiting downstairs. I've been ordered to bring you here at once. The officer clicked his heels kindly. Give me 15 minutes. I put the package on the table. I dressed quickly, shook the dust off my epaulets, and strapped on my checker. Wendy, take care of Cindy. I need to get away. I put on my cap. Ah, it sounded behind me. Cindy, eyes wide open, rushed in surprise at me dressed in an officer's uniform in full parade. I grinned in satisfaction. Damn it, it's nice to make young ladies lose their minds at the sight of you. His Excellency is about to perceive. The young adjutant grumbled and swung the door open. I walked across the soft carpet to a large oak table, at which sat a not yet old state general in a dress uniform. Come in, Stephen. He waved his hand cordially, showing me to a soft leather sofa in front of which stood a service table. The adjutant filled shot glasses and moved a plate with an appetizer. I won't tell you what this is all about. You'll find out soon enough. Vaughn grinned slyly. In an hour we are waiting for the sovereign. I even choked up cognac stuck in my throat. Who is waiting? I asked through a cough. Your Majesty. His Excellency patted me on the back. Let's have a drink and get on our way. The state councilor corrected a strand of hair that had fallen on his face with a familiar gesture. I even flinched. I couldn't stop thinking about Cindy as we walked down the long corridor. I was happy for her, if I wasn't mistaken. That girl was going to do well. A chamber footman ushered us into a huge hall. A burly, bearded man rose from behind a large miscellaneous table. Emperor Alexander II came out to meet us. We stopped and bowed our heads. Your Majesty started to share, but the Emperor stopped him with a gesture. Why the unnecessary words, gentlemen? Tell me, Joseph, have you thought about my proposal? The Emperor's voice was soft, but in it you could feel the hidden strength of a man who left the whole of Europe trembling. Yes, my lord, I agree. Dennis looked faithfully into the Emperor's eyes. The Emperor nodded with satisfaction. And you, Baron? I didn't realize at first which raven we were talking about, except for the Emperor and us here. There was no one else in the hall. He doesn't know yet. Your Majesty, smiled Dennis. He was not in Street Petersburg. Alexander II looked at me with a smile. 3 days ago, I granted your father nobility and the title of Baron for his invaluable help in building the Siberian Railroad. So you are now a second-generation Baron. The Emperor and Dennis laughed. I want to appoint you Deputy Chief of the Palace Police, the Emperor continued, and looked at my companion. That's his deputy, I didn't think for a long time. I agree. Well, then congratulations on the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The Emperor sat down at the table. Gentlemen, I give you a month to organize the department. Tonight I dined at a place not on the Moika. To tell you the truth, I didn't like the bohemian bustle of restaurants, but this evening I wanted to be among people. Loneliness was weighing me down. I didn't risk taking the whole with me. It looked very provincial. Knowing the morals of our and glamorous young ladies, I did not want to expose a nice girl to their ridicule. I was in euphoria from the events of today. First the news of Lisa's betrayal and escape, then the visit to the sovereign. A new appointment, a newly acquired title and rank, all of which would have made anyone's head spin. I was sitting alone at a table, away from the hustle and bustle of the world. When I heard a familiar laugh, I looked up. Almost opposite me was a group of young people, among whom my wife was laughing. Even from here I could see how she was looking at the gentleman with the thin mustache under his nose. Around their table the waiters were bustling. Wine. Bring wine. One of the girls shouted loudly. And that's when Lisa saw me. Her face turned white. Her companion intercepted her gaze and stared at me too. Everything was mixed up in his gaze. Fear, insolence, arrogance. Without getting up, he summoned the maitre d'. I always thought your restaurant was for a clean crowd. Deliberately loud so I could hear, he said. The noise at their table died down. Everyone stared at me in silence, expecting a scandal and my ignominious expulsion from the Restoration. Yes, for the public that knows how to behave in a public place and with money, politely replied the meter man. Then what's this bullshit doing here? Sebastian nodded in my direction, and the maitre d' looked at me. I realized that Sebastian was known here, but it was the first time they had seen me. The maitre d' didn't know how to behave in such a case and didn't dare to do anything. I decided to come to his rescue. I rubbed my lips straight with a napkin, took my cane and approached a neighboring table. Don't worry, my good man. I'll take care of it in a moment. It's just a minor misunderstanding. I smiled affectionately at Sebastian. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Eliza turn even more pale with fear, clutching the lezginka in her chair. I turned to my wife. It seems to me that you have lost track of time. It's time to get ready to go home. There's a carriage waiting for us at the entrance. Sebastian jumped up. Lisa isn't going anywhere. I looked at my lover in amazement. My soul. Who is that boy in my voice? Only a fool could fail to sense the obvious sneer. Lisa shook her head, unable to utter a word. I would challenge you to a duel. You bastard. Sebastian was seething with rage. But you're not a nobleman, so get out of here. He grabbed me by the lapel of my jacket, seriously intending to throw me out of this noble establishment. Two young Shegolevs, who were sitting at the table, came up to help him. Here I realized that it was time to act. I sharply hit Sebastian with my knee in the groin, and while he moved in pain, he raked his privates into a heap. I dropped the cane, and with two palms hit him in the ears. It's the kind of blow that bursts eardrums. The pain is unbelievable. Sebastian even forgot from the pain. But that wasn't enough for me. I hit him in the jaw with my right hand. Sebastian was thrown up, and he flew into a corner, picking his way into a pile of empty tables. I turned to his companions. The young men were already seated and looking at me fearfully. It looked like this was the first time they had seen such a fight. I picked up my cane, glad I didn't need my sword. Lisa, I'm waiting, I said to my wife. It's time to go. She silently got up and walked out. I slipped the maitre d' $5 for material and moral damage. He nodded understandingly, tucking the money into his breast pocket. I followed Lisa out the door. I didn't want to talk to that lying bastard at all. But it was a matter of principle. As long as she's my wife, she should be home. I'll throw her out. When will I finally decide what to do with her? In the morning, a policeman came and took me to the courthouse. The elderly judge took a long look at me and wrapped Sebastian's screws around which Lohankin was fussing. And the lawyer then asked me the question, why did you beat up this gentleman? I shrugged. The man attacked me in front of witnesses. I was only defending myself. The judge hummed and looked at the renamed Sebastian again. But you don't have a scratch on you. Witnesses show that you beat him methodically. The judge menacingly, frowning his eyebrows, especially since this gentleman is a nobleman. And you knew that? Yes, I did. And what does that mean? Is his blood a different color, or is he immortal? The judge was beginning to annoy me. The judge opened his mouth to put the boar in his place, which was me. As the courtroom creaked with boots cleaned, an adjutant of the chief of the palace police entered. He unceremoniously approached the judge and whispered something in his ear. The judge seemed to deflate. He looked at me with a completely different look. It was a look of genuine paternal concern. Well, Stephen, why didn't you just say so? He even stood up. Mr. Baron, I'm dropping all charges against you. You are free to go. I stood up, turned around, and without looking at Mr. Sebastian, walked towards the exit. You should have seen the look on his face that very day. I brought the hole where they fight. They looked at each other in silence for a long time. Finally, a tear ran down Joseph's cheek. Daddy! The girl screamed and threw herself into her father's arms. What else can be added? Kinship is kinship. For years, Joseph was sure that his only daughter died in childbirth. I left the office without saying anything. They had a lot to talk about. A month later, the sovereign granted the divorce. I rented an apartment for Lisa and tried to forget her. You can imagine her state of mind when she found out she'd lost her nobility and title again. And the money, and her husband too. She tried to get back together with me, but as you can see, in vain. Betrayal is unforgivable. Lisa lived in Street Petersburg for a while, but then she sold her apartment and left. Her fate is unknown to me. Sebastian confused everything with the SRs and was soon shot by the police during an expropriation. Christopher Wyzemski lost at cards, so he was forced to sell the mortgaged estate. My father bought it and gave it to my mother as a reminder of her happy childhood. And I plunged into my work. I decided for myself no more women. Enough. What else but trouble can you expect from them? I distanced myself from Cindy in every way possible. Excuse me, Cindy Joseph. Joseph officially recognized her as his daughter. She must have been hoping for something. But I made it very clear that I would not marry her under any circumstances. Cindy seemed to calm down. She was now selling a collection of Russian, and I hardly saw her. One evening in late November, I was sitting in my office and leafed through a fresh catalog, which I sent me from old memory my agent in Berlin. The doorbell rang, and Wendy announced that Cindy had come to pick up her things. A few minutes later, she entered my office. In her hands was one of the sculptures we had taken out of a young African man holding a jug. Cindy set it on the stone shelf. "This is a keepsake for you." Then she gaped at us for a moment. I shrugged, playing off indifference. Cindy stood for a moment longer and then suddenly asked if I could have something to keep as a souvenir. "Cindy, take anything you want." I loved that girl, but I couldn't help myself. "Principals, gentlemen." "Thank you, Stephen." Blushing, Wendy called out. The maid brought an open bottle of champagne and 2 tall flutes. "Let's have a drink." Cindy sat down on the edge of the couch and handed me the wine flute. I lightly touched the rim of her flute and in one fell swoop drank the contents with the last thing I saw. Before I passed out Cindy's satisfied face, I opened my eyes to my chest. Something was pressing. I lowered my head slightly, and in the light of the boss I saw my female head. While building on my hairy chest, Cindy cautiously peeked under the blanket. Both me and the girl were unclothed. I didn't realize anything about how I ended up in bed with her. She felt me moving and opened her eyes. "You said yourself that I can take anything I want as a memento. So I took you." I wanted to say something, but she covered my mouth with a passionate kiss.